In the heart of the Middle Ages, when the roads to Jerusalem ran with both prayer and blood, a brotherhood arose unlike any the world had ever seen. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. To pilgrims, they were guardians, clad in white mantles marked with the Red Cross, escorting the faithful across dangerous frontiers. To kings, they were bankers and administrators, able to marshal resources across kingdoms with a precision no crown could match. To enemies, they were fearsome warriors, disciplined where others were reckless, unyielding where others broke. From humble beginnings, just 9 knights, with little more than a vow, they grew into an international force, with castles from Portugal to the Levant, estates spread across Europe, fleets at sea, and treasuries filled with the wealth of monarchs. For nearly 2 centuries, their presence defined the Crusader world. They prayed like monks and fought like soldiers, balancing faith and steel in a paradox no other order could embody. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these journeys. And while you're getting comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that gather here for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. They wore white in a violent age cloth, the colour of confession, cut simple and stark, a red cross laid over the heart, like a vow you could see from a hilltop. To men who measured the world by banners and lineage, they arrived without coats of arms, without private glory, and promised something at once impossible and irresistible, that steel and prayer, harnessed together, might hold a frontier where empires had broken and saints had bled. For 2 centuries, from 1119 to 1312, the Knights Templar threaded themselves through the warp and weft of medieval life so completely that kings banked with them, popes exempted them, enemies studied them, and common people whispered about them in marketplaces. Their rise was an engineering feat of the human spirit. Take the restless strength of the feudal knight, bind it with the rhythms of a monastery, and set it to work on the most perilous roads in the world. Their fall was a masterclass in politics. Engineer a crime large enough to frighten Europe, then seize what those white mantles guarded. Between those poles, the vow and the pyre, lies the story you are about to enter. It begins not with a secret rite, but with a problem. At the end of the 11th century, a pilgrim to Jerusalem needed more than faith. He needed luck. Europe, frayed into dukedoms and counties, had turned its violence inward for generations, only to lash out across the sea when Pope Urban II preached at Clermont in November 1095. "God wills it," men roared, and sewed crosses into their cloaks, and marched toward a city they knew mostly from sermons. The First Crusade was a human avalanche, desperate, devout, and often undisciplined. It succeeded beyond expectation and decency. By July 1099, a new Christian kingdom stood where the Fatimids had held sway, its streets still wet with the memory of what it cost. Then the avalanche melted. Thousands returned home, vows fulfilled, penance achieved. What remained in Outremer a thin string of ports and fortresses, and the holy places themselves was precious, exposed, and chronically underdefended. That is the hinge on which the Templars swing into view. Picture the coast road from Jaffa, heat pooling among the stones, thorn and scrub tugging at the hooves, and a long file of travellers carrying offerings and sins. Bandits watched that road, as did raiders testing the fringes of a new kingdom. The pilgrims had their prayers. They did not have a reliable escort. Royal garrisons were small, their duties many, and their captains not always eager to spend themselves guarding strangers. A solution would have to be both practical and strange enough to satisfy the century. Take knights, those specialists in controlled violence, and bind them by monastic vows, so that protection became an act of religion. Obedience, a military virtue, and poverty, a collective reservoir from which the order, not the man, could draw. In 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Pont proposed precisely that to Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem. 9 men began it, 9 in a city contested by millions. Their poverty was not a legend invented later to flatter the past. It was a discipline that left marks. The seal they would adopt 2 riders on 1 horse was not merely a symbol of humility, but a practical memory. In those first years, equipment was donated piecemeal, garments were shared, the bread at table was measured, and the rule still unwritten lived in the habits of men too busy to explain themselves. They took the monastic triad poverty, chastity, obedience and applied it to a cavalry unit. Poverty meant no personal hoard, but it did not mean shabby arms. The order outfitted the man because the man's body was a tool leased to a mission. Chastity meant a conscious separation from the social circuits that entangled secular knights, and with it, a strict regulation of contact, no private audiences, no festivals, no tournaments. Obedience meant that the thing most prized in feudal society, the personal impulse toward glory, had to be turned inward and made a furnace for duty. In those same years, Europe was in a late morning light of reform and consolidation. The papacy, having wrestled with emperors over the right to clothe bishops with ring and staff, had learned to speak like a sovereign. The Cistercians, with their severe beauty, were teaching Christendom to prefer clean lines to gilded edges, and their most luminous voice, Bernard of Clairvaux, was learning the grammar of influence. To men like Bernard, the idea of warrior monks at first tasted like contradiction, but contradiction can be resolved by purpose. When Hugues de Pons crossed back into Europe around 1127 to seek recognition and recruits, his cause met the eloquence it needed. At the Council of Troyes in January 1129, ecclesiastical authority took the prototype and gave it bones, a rule that read like a marriage of cloister and camp. The hierarchy was sketched Grandmaster at the apex, marshals and seneschals beneath, commanders anchoring houses scattered from the Levant to the Channel. The day was ordered with prayer and drill. Even hair and beard were regulated not to erase the man, but to erase the distractions that might make him less than a brother. Soon after, the white mantle, already a sign of their chosen simplicity, received its red cross, sanctioned as a badge of sacrificial service. The Templars were no longer an expedient, they were an institution. Symbols matter, but systems endure. Gifts began to arrive with charters as precise as ledgers. A mill here, an estate there, revenues from a town, a right to pasture, a chapel with its tithes. A web of commanderies grew across Europe, modest in appearance and formidable in effect. The genius was not accumulation for its own sake, but direction. A share of these European incomes flowed eastward along predictable arteries. Grain turned to hardtack, silver turned to spearheads, rents turned to rations and remounts, so that even when kings delayed and bishops argued, convoy captains in the Levant could count the weeks to the next shipment. This is where the order's poverty becomes paradox. They owned nothing personally and managed much collectively, and that collective pool allowed them to do what no feudal household could do for long: sustain war as a service, not as an adventure. They learned the land. Castles were not trophies but instruments, pressure points in stone, each with a purpose: watch a valley, choke a pass, harbour a fleet. They adopted the bent gate and the angled kill zone, reinforced cisterns against siege thirst, and built in layers, so a lost wall was an invitation to spend more enemy lives for less ground. The Templar house at the centre of a frontier was a monastery in mood and an armoury in function. The chapel bell called men to lords, and the horn called them to saddles. There is a firm line in the rule about retreat, not unless overwhelmingly outnumbered. It is the line of a commander who understands that the myth of a brotherhood rests on what the brothers will not do. It would give them a reputation that comforted their friends and concentrated the minds of their enemies. They learned the sea as well. A kingdom by the water must practice afloat. In ports like Acre and Tyre, the order raised quays and slipways and warehouses, commissioning hulls that could ferry horses and men, chase pirates along the coast, and convoy pilgrims whose prayers would turn to panic if wind and wave had their way. Sailors from Genoa or Venice brought techniques. Captains from the order brought policy. Keep the lanes open, keep the timetables predictable, and make the sea a bridge rather than a barrier. When later kings arrived with armies gaudy and brave, they found Templar quartermasters and shipmasters already moving quietly, building pontoons, shortening sieges by months of labour no troubadour would ever sing. If you wish to understand the Templars' peculiar authority in Europe, climb the stair in Paris to the temple's great tower and feel the air change. The crown's accountants felt it too. There, the walls were thick enough to mute a city's noise and strong enough to make a king's treasure feel safe. Monarchs stored regalia in those rooms. Merchants deposited chests that would have tempted lesser guards. Widows and abbots and princelings brought what they could not carry and what they dared not keep. In London, the new temple mirrored the function, a house of God with a vault beneath it, and a set of clerks as fluent in columns as in psalms. The letters of credit that pilgrims carried, inked with signs known to brothers along the route, were simple in principle and revolutionary in practice. They shifted risk from the individual to the institution and turned the order into Europe's most dependable messenger of value. When a French king changed the coinage to stretch his reach, the order's clerks understood how depreciation nibbled at hoards and advised their clients accordingly. They were not theorists. They were practitioners whose experiments were measured in whether cargo arrived and soldiers ate. Yet it would be a mistake to think of them only in systems, only in flows of grain and silver and men. At dawn, a bell woke bodies already conditioned by the work of the day before. Matins murmured in a chapel smelling faintly of oil and wool. Mass sent men back into the square of light where tack was checked and hooves were picked. Mail counted and belts buckled. At the refectory, silence was a habit, and scripture the sound that travelled with the bread. Meat came 3 times a week, not because the flesh was a luxury, but because the work demanded it. A brother's hair was cut not as a fad, but to fit under a helm. His beard was trimmed as the rule required. His eyes learned to look beyond personal ornament to the line of the formation and the incline of the ground. Training meant reins in hand, lance couched, the feel of a charge held until the signal was given. It meant learning not to draw forward when the mouth tasted victory, because the line's integrity was dearer than one man's triumph. It meant an ethic, armour for the body, prayer for the soul, both maintained daily. Discipline had edges. A forgotten grooming requirement might mean a light penance, a neglected strap, a heavier one, a broken obedience, a punishment that left a mark, and sometimes, if the offence reached the reputation of the order, dismissal that ended a life's identity. But brothers wrote home, some did, and those letters hold a different light. The bed is harder, one wrote. The meal's plainer, but the mind sleeps. Secular knighthood had been an endless season of courting favour and rescuing pride. Here the line was clear, the purpose outward, the company predictable in its virtues and its faults. This is how institutions that last are felt from within, not as machines, but as communities whose rules make space for rest. From here, the arc bends toward confrontation, the slow test of every system by the weight of an enemy determined to learn it. In the later 12th century, names like Nur al-Din and Saladin organized the forces against which the White Mantles would ride. At Montgisard in 1177, with a teenage king strapping armour over disease and a handful of disciplined cavalry at his side, A Templar spearhead helped break an army that should have rolled them flat. At Hattin in July 1187, on ground chosen by thirst and inevitability, discipline met arithmetic and burned. After that, Jerusalem fell, an event that did not end the Templars, but changed the map of their responsibilities. They learned to live as guardians of a coast. They built the sea into their doctrine. They made castles into harbours for hope. And for more than a century after Hattin, when crusading became a word that princes used and common soldiers dreaded, the white mantles still kept watch on walls that most of Europe remembered only in sermons and maps. But the contradictions that had made them powerful, poverty that managed wealth, obedience that tempered courage, sanctity that justified violence, would make them vulnerable when the geography shifted and the politics darkened. An order answerable to the papacy and embedded in every economy in Europe could be indispensable while the Holy Land remained an objective. What would it be when Acre fell and the frontier moved to account books and memory? For that answer, you have to walk west to Paris, to a Friday in October, and to a king whose debts needed a theology. Before we go there, before the arrests and the trials and the fire, we must first follow the brothers through the practices that made them what they were, their training, their castles, their ships, and their quiet revolution in money. Only then will the shock of their suppression be fully visible, not as a quirk of superstition, but as the collision of a new kind of monarchy with an institution that had dared to be international, disciplined, and rich in a world that was becoming national, centralized, and hungry. The white mantle is still visible in the mind from this distance because it solved a puzzle that never quite goes away: how to bind power to purpose, how to take the talents that lead men to seize and redirect them towards stewardship. The Templars did it with vows, with rules, with rituals repeated until they seeped into reflex. The story that follows is not the tale of their perfection, it is the tale of their experiment. It begins with 9 men who chose to be less, so that their order could be more, and with a city that had to be reached over roads where prayer alone was not enough. Frontier wealth and resource networks. Frontiers were the lifeblood of the Templars. To understand their survival and their influence, you must picture not only the famous castles of the Holy Land, but the quieter, slower transformation of forgotten landscapes in Europe itself. In Iberia, where Christian kingdoms pressed against the remaining strongholds of Al-Andalus, rulers entrusted the order with vast, underdeveloped estates. These grants were not gifts in the sense of ready treasure, they were wilderness, forest, or scrubland, dangerous and unprofitable until someone with discipline and vision reshaped them. The brothers proved remarkably skilled at this reshaping. They cleared forests where wolves still prowled, drained marshes that bred sickness, and raised mills on the backs of new canals and streams. They laid out villages with chapels at their hearts, anchoring communities that could sustain agriculture. Defensive towers rose alongside granaries, because every frontier settlement was both a home and a redoubt. In Hungary, in Aragon, in Leon, in the harsh edges of Portugal, the Templars repeated this formula: land into settlement, settlement into estate, estate into dependable resource for the wider mission. This is where their genius for organization showed most clearly. They treated each frontier not as an isolated holding, but as a cog in a greater system. What wheat was threshed in Castile might, within a season, be counted as part of the revenues supporting men and horses at Acre. What wool was clipped in a Portuguese pasture might end its journey as coin for the garrison of a castle in Galilee. The mechanism was not improvisation, it was codified. A set percentage of revenues from European estates flowed eastward, a steady current that kept the Order's eastern armies alive when the enthusiasm of kings and nobles faltered. This resource pipeline gave the Templars an extraordinary advantage. Other crusaders were often dependent on sudden donations, papal tithes, or the sporadic generosity of lords who tired of the cause. But the Templars' system functioned regardless of passing moods. When political crises shook Europe, or when papal disputes snarled diplomacy, convoys of grain and coin still moved toward the ports of the Levant. After the catastrophic loss of Jerusalem in 1187, this distributed infrastructure did not collapse. Castles still received supply, garrisons were still paid. Where a kingdom might falter, the order endured. It was resilience born of diversity. A lord's estate, struck by famine or plague, might ruin him, but the Templars held lands scattered from Scotland to Sicily, from Poland to Portugal. Loss in one quarter could be offset by gain in another. When Muslim counterattacks disrupted commerce in the east, resources were redirected through alternate ports or overland routes, the whole system adapting like a body shifting its weight. This adaptability made them less vulnerable to shocks than more centralized medieval powers. Such economic strength did not go unnoticed. Kings and princes realized that here was an institution with the ability to mobilize wealth across borders, to fund armies faster than feudal levies could be raised. The French monarchy in particular grew entangled with the Templars, using their treasuries to store royal jewels, their clerks to manage crown finances, their estates to collect and transfer taxes. What began as religious trust turned into political dependence. The men who managed these operations were not merely monks in armor. They were administrators with a practical understanding of money far beyond their age. Surviving records show their awareness of exchange rates between currencies, their attention to inflation and debasement, their careful protection of capital reserves. When kings manipulated coinage, the Templar clerks adjusted their advice to clients, steering them toward currencies less likely to erode in value. Archaeology has added flesh to these records. Excavations of Templar sites have uncovered storage rooms with standardized compartments, evidence of inventory systems far ahead of their time. Workshops show layouts optimized for production efficiency, with tasks arranged in logical sequences resembling a primitive assembly line. Agricultural installations reveal advanced water management, aqueducts, irrigation channels, and mills designed to squeeze every ounce of productivity from the land. These operations did more than enrich the order. They reshaped the regions around them. Local markets grew up around Templar commanderies. Roads improved where their caravans traveled. Ports prospered from their trade. Even secular merchants adopted their practices, especially in finance. The letters of credit pioneered in Templar counting houses spread outward, becoming tools of international commerce. Estate management, tenant systems, even workshop organization all bore the imprint of their disciplined approach. What made this so powerful was not theory but pragmatism. The brothers were not economic philosophers. They did not write treatises on wealth, they solved problems. If an existing method failed, they invented another, guided by the question, does it work, and can it be made to work everywhere? Their lack of interest in abstract justification allowed them to move faster than others bound by tradition. They were, in a sense, medieval engineers of organization taking ideals and turning them into functioning systems. And yet, behind all this, they remained monks. Their white mantles were not only banners on the battlefield, but uniforms in the counting house. Their communal life, their vows, and their discipline infused even their economic work. To them, careful inventory was not just accounting, it was stewardship. Agricultural reform was not just profit, it was service to God's mission. The same mindset that made them hold a line in battle made them balance a ledger in Paris. This integration of the spiritual with the practical may have been their most enduring achievement. Long after the fall of Acre, long after their mantles had been stripped away in the streets of Paris, the systems they built continued to shape Europe. Their methods outlived their order, influencing banks, estates, and treasuries for centuries. While history remembers the battles, it is these quiet revolutions, the mills, the ledgers, the convoys that carried their legacy into the future. It is here, at the junction of land and ledger, that the Templars showed their true genius. They were warriors, yes, but they were also builders of economies, custodians of wealth, architects of networks that stretched across a continent. And in this paradox, poor knights, who became Europe's most reliable bankers, lay the seeds of both their unmatched power and their eventual peril. For wealth draws eyes, and power draws envy, and the very kings who depended on them would one day turn those eyes into accusations. The daily rule of the white mantle. If the Templars were an enigma to their contemporaries, it was not only because they managed wealth and wielded arms. It was because they lived by a rhythm so strict and so unusual that no one else in medieval society quite resembled them. Neither monks cloistered behind abbey walls nor knights bound by the obligations of feudal service. The Templars inhabited a third space, a hybrid vocation where prayer and combat coexisted in the same body, and where a man's hours were portioned out like the beads on a rosary. The day began in darkness. Before the sun lifted its first colour over the horizon, a bell cut through the dormitory halls. Brothers rose from rope-strung beds, straw mattresses creaking under leather boots hastily laced. Silence was expected. Conversation had no place at this hour. They moved together toward the chapel, white mantles brushing stone corridors, the red cross visible even by lamplight. Matins was the first office of the day, a low chorus of psalms and prayers that set the tone. Before a lance was lowered, before a horse was mounted, the voice was lifted to God. After Mass came the first meal, a modest breakfast, bread coarse but filling, sometimes accompanied by cheese or a little watered wine. It was never indulgent, always functional, for the day's demands required fuel more than flavour. Once eaten, the morning turned outward into labour. For those garrisoned in the east, this often meant drill. Knights rode out into courtyards, practicing formation charges, learning to pivot by signal, rehearsing the discipline that distinguished them from the looser cavalcades of secular lords. Squires and sergeants joined them, the younger learning the weight of sword and shield, the older refining skills already proven in battle. Elsewhere, the hours filled with different duties. At frontier castles, brothers patrolled walls, tested gates, inspected cisterns. At inland commanderies, they checked accounts, supervised serfs, directed harvests, or oversaw shipments bound for ports. For a Templar, no task was beneath him, for nothing was his alone. A horse was not personal property, it belonged to the order. The sword at his side was not his to boast of it, was a trust, to be kept sharp and ready, not ornamented for show. The rule demanded meticulous care, armour scoured against rust, tack-oiled, blades inspected for notches. To neglect equipment was to neglect God's mission, and punishment could follow negligence as swiftly as cowardice. By midday, the bell rang again, calling all to prayer. The chapel filled once more, psalms breaking the rhythm of work. Immediately after came the main meal of the day. The refectory was a long hall of trestle tables. Brothers sat according to rank, but the food was the same for all: bread, beans, vegetables, and, on 3 days of the week, meat. The rule allowed meat in recognition of the brothers' exertions, but indulgence was forbidden. Meals were eaten in silence. A reader stood at a lectern and read scripture or the writings of the fathers while the rest ate. Only gestures, not words, were permitted to request what one needed. The afternoon was a patchwork of tasks. Those stationed in the east might ride escort duty along dangerous roads, guiding pilgrims through ambush-prone passes. Others might drill again, maintain siege engines, or scout the terrain. In Europe, afternoons often meant agricultural management, directing ploughing teams, inspecting vineyards, or collecting rents. Still, others handled correspondence, writing letters in Latin to distant preceptors, or managing the careful ledgers that tracked every bushel, coin, and shipment. The Templar world was broad, and so their daily duties varied. but the rhythm of obedience bound them together. As evening came, the brothers returned for Vespers, the setting sun lighting chapels with red and gold. After prayer, a lighter supper was served, followed by the final office of the day, compline. Once compline ended, silence descended. No idle talk, no wandering. Brothers returned to the dormitory, where beds stood side by side, identical and austere. Privacy was alien to the order. Community was everything. Uniformity extended beyond clothing. Hair was cut short to fit under helmets. Beards were trimmed but never shaved completely, distinguishing them from the fashions of secular courts. The effect, to outsiders, was striking. A company of men almost indistinguishable from one another, united not by blood but by vows. From a distance, a column of white mantles with red crosses advancing on horseback presented a sight as intimidating as it was otherworldly. The order regulated even speech. Silence reigned at meals and after compline. During working hours, only necessary words were permitted. Idle chatter was discouraged, gossip punished. Formal communication took place in chapter meetings, where matters of discipline or administration were raised. Brothers spoke in order of rank, and disputes were handled within the framework of communal discipline. Infractions could mean extra prayers, fasting, or even corporal punishment, depending on severity. The rule also imposed strict boundaries with the outside world. Women were forbidden within commanderies. Brothers rarely travelled alone, at least two went together, ensuring mutual accountability. Entertainment as secular knights knew it, tournaments, feasts, hunts was forbidden. Physical recreation was permitted only if it served a practical purpose. Swimming to exercise horses, target games that sharpened martial skills, sparring that honed reflexes. And yet, despite the strictness, many brothers found meaning in this life. Letters that survive speak of the contrast with their former secular existence. One knight wrote of leaving behind idle hunts and vain displays for a life of prayer and protection. Another wrote that though the bed was harder and the meals plainer, his soul was at rest. For men weary of the endless cycle of feudal rivalry and personal ambition, the Templar rule offered something rare: clarity of purpose. Diversity marked the order, too. Frenchmen, Englishmen, Germans, Spaniards, Italians all lived side by side. Latin bound them in prayer and correspondence, but daily life demanded multilingualism. Brothers taught each other words, shared regional skills, learned from one another. In this, the Templars were unusually international, their houses scattered across Christendom, their membership drawing from every corner of Europe. Health was not ignored. Infirmaries staffed by brothers with medical training offered care more systematic than most secular lords could provide. Hygiene regulations were surprisingly practical. Clean water, adequate clothing for varying climates, attention to diet. In the East, where European armies often withered from disease, Templar garrisons maintained greater resilience thanks to these preventive measures. The rhythm of the year brought variation. Easter and Christmas saw more elaborate liturgies and rare feasting. Agricultural cycles shaped activity in Europe, ploughing in spring, harvest in autumn, indoor work in winter. But beneath these seasonal shifts, the backbone of the rule remained constant. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is the psychological balance this life required. These men were trained for violence, but sworn to humility, living monastic schedules while preparing for war. They held vows of poverty while managing enormous wealth, lived without women while dedicating their order to the Virgin Mary, wielded swords in service of a gospel that preached peace. To reconcile these contradictions demanded a mindset unlike that of either monk or knight. For many, the rule itself provided the structure to bear that tension. For others, the strain proved too much, and they left. Yet across generations, the rule held. From the early years in Jerusalem to the final garrisons in Cyprus, The daily pattern of prayer, work, training, and silence remained the spine of their identity. It created continuity, a sense that a brother in 1119 and a brother in 1290 shared more than a habit. They shared a way of life that made them Templars, whatever land they stood upon. The white mantle was a banner, but the rule was the true garment. It clothed their hours, their meals, their words, their very thoughts. It made them more than a scattered band of knights. It made them a brotherhood. And it was this discipline, perhaps more than any treasure or fortress, that gave the order its endurance. War as vocation. The Templars were not born to linger in cloisters. Their vows tied them to prayer, but their mission bound them to battlefields. To a medieval observer, this was their most bewildering quality. Men who prayed like monks, yet rode into combat like seasoned captains, charging with lances levelled, red crosses gleaming against dust. And Sunday, where secular knights fought for honour, land, or ransom, the Templars fought for something else, a vow. From their earliest years, their presence in the field altered the complexion of Crusader armies. In the 1132, scarcely a decade after their recognition at the Council of Troyes, Templar contingents began appearing alongside royal forces in sieges and campaigns. Their reputation grew quickly. Where feudal levies often broke formation in search of plunder, the Templars maintained their lines. Where other knights scattered in pursuit, the Templars rallied to horns and standards, their discipline giving Crusader armies a backbone otherwise too often missing. One of the first great tests came at the siege of Ascalon in 1153. Ascalon was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fortified city from which Egyptian armies launched raids. When a section of wall collapsed under bombardment, the Templars, led by Grandmaster Bernard de Tremblay, rushed forward, determined to secure the breach before the defenders regrouped. Chroniclers disagree on their motives. Some accuse them of selfish haste, others claim tactical foresight, but all agree on the result. Isolated within the city, Bernard and some 40 knights were overwhelmed and killed. Their bodies lay unrecovered until Ascalon finally fell days later. The loss was grievous, but the image of their valor charging first into danger, refusing to retreat, added to the aura of a brotherhood that asked everything of its members. As decades passed, the Templars became indispensable in the great contests of the Levant. At Montgisard in 1177, their courage turned the tide. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, stricken with leprosy and barely able to sit a horse, commanded a tiny force facing Saladin's massive army of perhaps 26,000 men. Outnumbered more than 10-1, Baldwin's army seemed doomed, but in a bold stroke, he chose to attack. The Templars, about 80 in number under Grandmaster Odo de Saint-Amand, led the charge. Their lances struck first, splitting Saladin's vanguard, creating confusion that spread like fire through his columns. The result was astonishing. Saladin's army collapsed into a rout, many cut down during their desperate retreat. Chroniclers saw divine intervention, but they also noted the ferocity and discipline of the Templars as the spear point of victory. Yet triumph was often fleeting. The great disaster of Hattin in 1187 showed the limits of courage against poor strategy. King Guy of Lusignan, ignoring cautious voices, including some from the Templar ranks, led his army into the arid hills of Galilee during midsummer. Far from secure water sources, Saladin encircled the Crusaders, cutting them off from wells. Thirst and exhaustion sapped their strength. The Templars, fighting in the rearguard, charged repeatedly to break the encirclement, but the army disintegrated around them. When the final stand came on the horns of Hattin, most of the order's contingent lay dead or captured. Saladin, respecting their reputation but fearing their return, ordered some 200 Templars and Hospitallers executed, personally overseeing their beheadings. The loss was catastrophic, not only in numbers but in morale. Within months, Jerusalem itself fell. This massacre set a grim precedent. Secular knights might expect ransom, Templars did not. Their vow bound them to fight to the death, and their enemies understood that sparing them only prolonged danger. For the brothers, this meant that capture was a death sentence. For the order as a whole, it became part of their legend. Soldiers who asked no quarter and gave none. Even in defeat, the Templars proved resilient. After Hattin, they regrouped along the coast, fortifying strongholds and supplying the Third Crusade. When Richard the Lionheart arrived in 1191, he quickly recognized their value. Templars scouted terrain, organized logistics, and held key positions in his battle formations. At the Siege of Acre, they fought with characteristic tenacity. In open battle, Richard often placed them at the center or the vanguard, trusting their discipline to hold against Saladin's maneuvers. Beyond combat, their financial system sustained the Crusader host when royal treasuries ran dry. Few allies were so reliable, even to kings. The 13th century brought more campaigns, the Fifth Crusade in Egypt, the diplomatic experiment of the Sixth Crusade under Frederick II, and the disastrous defeat at La Forbie in 1244, where a coalition of Crusader forces, including hundreds of Templars, was annihilated. At La Forbie, chroniclers said the slaughter rivaled Hattin. Almost the entire Templar contingent fell, along with their Grandmaster Armand de Périgord, whose fate, dead or captured, was never confirmed. The order rebuilt, but the blow further weakened the Christian position in the east. Despite these calamities, the Templars adapted. They integrated crossbowmen into their forces, employed engineers for sieges, and experimented with lighter cavalry to counter fast-moving Muslim horsemen. Their fortresses grew more elaborate, designed with concentric walls, angled arrow slits, and complex gatehouses to resist ever-improving siege weapons. Their castles at Seyfed, Tortosa, and Chateau Pellerin became symbols of endurance, resisting for years against overwhelming odds. But all defences eventually failed. By the late 13th century, the Mamluks under Sultan Baybars and his successors systematically dismantled the Crusader presence. In 1291, the fall of Acre sealed the fate of the Templars in the Holy Land. As the city collapsed under Mamluk assault, Grandmaster Guillaume de Beaujeu was struck by an arrow and died, leading a counterattack. Surviving brothers retreated to their fortress, which held out briefly, buying time for civilians to flee by ship. When it too fell, the Order's last major stronghold in the east was gone. The Templars evacuated to Cyprus, but the dream of Outremer had ended. Through it all, the Templars' reputation as warriors remained unique. They were not invincible indeed. They suffered grievous defeats, but their courage, discipline, and willingness to die without ransom made them singular. Muslim chroniclers, though enemies, often wrote of their bravery with respect. Christian writers, though sometimes critical of their politics, acknowledged their unmatched role as the permanent defenders of Christendom's fragile hold in the East. War was their vocation, but not their glory. They did not fight for ransom or for banners. They fought because their rule commanded it, because their vows demanded it, and because they believed God himself had bound them to the defense of pilgrims and holy places. This mixture of piety and ferocity bewildered contemporaries, inspired allies, terrified foes, and ensured that the memory of the white mantle on the battlefield would outlive the order itself. Decline and the loss of Acre. The 12th century had been an age of promise for the Templars. Their castles guarded valleys, their convoys secured roads, their disciplined charges turned battles into victories. But by the 13th century, the ground beneath them began to shift. The Crusader kingdoms, once stretching deep into the Levant, had been reduced to a thin ribbon of coastal cities. Inland fortresses that once anchored Christian power fell one after another, until the white mantles stood as defenders not of a kingdom, but of enclaves pressed against the sea. The decline was not sudden, but gradual, a long erosion of advantage. After Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, the Templars regrouped in Acre and other coastal ports. They poured resources into rebuilding, erecting massive new fortifications at Château Pellerin, Safed, and Tortosa. These fortresses were marvels of military engineering, equipped with concentric defences, angled walls, cisterns, and towers designed to withstand siege engines. But stone could only delay the inevitable. Each castle required men, supplies, and money resources increasingly hard to sustain as Europe's interest in crusading waned. The Fifth Crusade, 1217-1221, revealed both the resilience and the vulnerability of the order. Targeting Egypt, the Crusaders captured the port of Damietta with Templar support, but the campaign collapsed when armies pressed too far into the Nile Delta. Exhaustion, disease, and poor leadership led to retreat. The Templars fought bravely, but discipline could not compensate for overreach. The Sixth Crusade, 1228-1229, brought a different kind of challenge. Emperor Frederick II negotiated Jerusalem's return through diplomacy rather than battle. For the Templars, this was deeply unsettling. They distrusted the treaty, which left the city without strong defences, and they considered Frederick's excommunication by the Pope a stain upon his authority. Though Jerusalem was restored temporarily, the order treated the arrangement with suspicion. Their caution was justified. Within a decade, Muslim forces reclaimed the city. By the mid-13th century, a new and formidable adversary rose, the Mamluks of Egypt. Unlike earlier Muslim rulers divided by rivalries, the Mamluks forged a unified state with a professional army of slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war. Under sultans like Baybars, their campaigns were relentless. They understood the Crusaders' weaknesses intimately and exploited them systematically. The catastrophe of La Forbie in 1244 marked another turning point. Facing a coalition of Egyptian and Khwarezmian forces, Crusader armies including hundreds of Templars were encircled and annihilated. Chroniclers said the slaughter rivaled Hattin in scale. The Grandmaster Armand de Périgord was lost, his fate never fully confirmed. The order was gutted but rebuilt, sending reinforcements from Europe. Yet the pattern was clear. Every major clash drained manpower that was increasingly hard to replace. Internal Christian divisions deepened the crisis. Italian merchant republics Venice, Genoa, Pisa waged private wars even within Crusader ports. In Acre during the War of Street, Sabas, 1256-1258, Genoese and Venetians fought bloody battles in the very streets, burning warehouses and killing allies while Muslim forces looked on with astonishment. Templars and Hospitallers, already rivals, sometimes found themselves drawn into these conflicts, further weakening unity. Meanwhile, castles once thought impregnable fell. In 1266, the mighty fortress of Safed, held by the Templars, succumbed after a long siege by Baybars. Its defenders were executed, an echo of Saladin's policy after Hattin. In 1271, Beaufort fell, another jewel lost. Step by step, the coastline shrank. The final crisis came with the siege of Acre in 1291. By then, Acre was the last major Crusader city, swollen with refugees and factional disputes. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought an army estimated at over 100,000, equipped with massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. The defenders, perhaps 20,000 strong, included Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and contingents from Europe. For weeks, the city endured relentless bombardment. The Templars fought at the breaches, counterattacking with grim determination. Their Grandmaster, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded by an arrow while leading a defence. "I am not fleeing," he is said to have told his men. "I am dead. Go on, defend the city." His body was carried away, but his words embodied the order's ethos, to fight to the end. On May 18th, the Mamluks broke through. Chaos consumed the city. Civilians fled toward the harbour, desperate for ships. The Templars withdrew into their massive fortress, continuing to resist even after the city had fallen. For days they held out, buying time for escape. Finally, undermined and shattered by siege engines, the fortress collapsed. Surviving brothers were captured and executed, in keeping with long-standing policy. With Acre's fall, the Crusader states ceased to exist. A Christian presence that had lasted nearly 2 centuries was gone in a single season of fire and ruin. The Templars evacuated to Cyprus, regrouping as best they could. From there, they launched occasional raids, but the age of Outremer was finished. For the Order, the loss of Acre was both a practical and existential blow. Their very identity had been bound to defending the Holy Land. Without Jerusalem, without Acre, without castles to hold, what was their purpose? They still owned vast estates in Europe, still managed banking networks, still commanded wealth, but their founding mission was gone. This void created a dangerous paradox. The Templars were at once immensely powerful and increasingly purposeless. Their economic independence, their international structure, and their immunity from local rulers had made sense when they were guardians of the East. Without that role, their privileges looked like anomalies, even provocations. Kings who once depended on them now eyed their riches with envy. In France, a monarch perpetually strapped for funds would soon decide that the easiest way to refill his treasury was to destroy the order itself. The fall of Acre, then, was more than the end of a city. It was the hinge between the Templars' outward mission and their inward crisis. It closed the era of battlefields and castles and opened the door to trials, prisons, and pyres. The white mantle, once a banner of victory, was about to become the symbol of an institution hunted by the very Christendom it had long defended. Suppression in the West. The fall of Acre in 1291 left the Templars displaced, but not dismantled. Their fleets still crossed the Mediterranean. Their estates in France, England, Iberia, and the Holy Roman Empire still yielded wealth. Their clerks still balanced ledgers in Paris and London, still issued letters of credit, still stored the treasures of kings. Yet a shadow hung over them. What use was a warrior order with no holy land to defend? For 2 centuries, their privileges, immunity from local taxation, direct allegiance to the Pope, freedom from secular courts had been tolerated because of their frontline mission. Without Acre, their purpose looked blurred. To some, they appeared as wealthy landlords disguised in white mantles. To others, they seemed like a state within a state, operating across borders with dangerous independence. No one understood this better than Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Tall, handsome, and outwardly dignified, he ruled with relentless calculation. Wars with England and Flanders had drained his treasury. His attempts to raise funds by debasing coinage, taxing clergy, and expelling Jews while seizing their property had provoked unrest and resistance. By 1307, he needed both money and authority. The Templars, with their immense holdings and semi-sovereign privileges, offered him both an irresistible prize and a perfect target. Philip's relationship with the order had once been cordial. He had deposited royal treasures in their Paris temple, trusted their clerks with fiscal duties, even taken refuge within their walls during a riot in 1306. But proximity breeds temptation. The temple fortress in Paris held vaults that could solve his financial crises overnight. If he could break the order, seize its wealth, and crush its autonomy, his crown would gain strength unimaginable a generation earlier. To achieve this, Philip needed more than greed, he needed justification. Here, his jurists, particularly Guillaume de Nogaret, proved invaluable. Nogaret was a master of Roman law and ruthless statecraft. He had already orchestrated the audacious attack on Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni in 1303, demonstrating his willingness to bend sacred institutions to royal will. Against the Templars, He prepared a strategy of accusation so shocking that it would silence sympathy, heresy. The charges were calculated for horror. According to the arrest warrants, the Templars denied Christ during secret initiations, spat upon the cross, engaged in obscene rituals, and worshipped a mysterious idol known as Baphomet. They were accused of granting absolution without clerical authority, of financial corruption, even of unnatural vice. The effect was designed not to prove, but to poison. Once such rumours spread, defence became nearly impossible. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the trap was sprung. At dawn, royal officials across France opened sealed orders and moved simultaneously against every Templar commandery. Knights were arrested, properties seized, records confiscated. In Paris, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, who had come to France to discuss a new crusade, was taken into custody alongside senior officers. By nightfall, the most powerful military order in Christendom had been decapitated. Shock rippled across Europe. Could it be true? Had men once hailed as the shield of Christendom betrayed their faith in secret? Philip ensured that confessions supported the charges. Under torture, stretching on racks, dislocating shoulders, foot roasting, starvation, and sleep deprivation, brothers confessed to what their inquisitors demanded. Some admitted to spitting on the cross, others to denying Christ, a few to worshipping strange heads. The stories conflicted, but the pattern was enough for Philip: guilt. Outside France, the results were different. In England, where torture was not customary, few Templars confessed. In Aragon, Castile, Germany, and Portugal, interrogations often found nothing beyond ordinary discipline. The contrast revealed the manufactured nature of the French case, but Philip pressed harder, knowing the Pope could not ignore such charges. Pope Clement V, himself French and elected with Philip's support, found himself trapped. As Pope, he owed the Templars protection. As a dependent of the French crown, he could not oppose Philip openly. In November 1307, Clement issued a papal bull ordering the arrest of Templars across Christendom. This gave Philip's actions a veneer of legitimacy, though outside France the proceedings rarely matched his brutality. In Paris, trials dragged on. Confessions obtained under torture were paraded, then recanted when pain subsided, then reaffirmed under renewed torment. Some brothers held out, denying every charge. Others broke, exhausted by months of cruelty. In 1310, when over 50 Templars recanted their confessions and defended the order publicly, Philip had them burned alive as relapsed heretics, a mass execution meant to silence resistance. The Pope vacillated. Councils debated. Was the order guilty or simply inconvenient? In 1312, under immense royal pressure and with a French army visible outside the council at Vienne, Clement dissolved the order by papal decree. He did not formally condemn them as heretics, there was too little evidence for that, but he suppressed them for the good of the Church. Their properties were officially transferred to the Hospitallers, though in France, Philip ensured much of the wealth stayed in royal hands. For Jacques de Molay, the final act came in March 1314. After years of imprisonment, he and Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, were brought before Notre Dame to hear their sentence of life imprisonment. To the shock of the crowd, both men recanted their earlier confessions, declaring the order innocent and their previous admissions the result of torture. The announcement threw officials into chaos. Philip acted swiftly. That same evening, Molay and de Charny were taken to a small island in the Seine, bound to stakes and burned alive. Chroniclers recorded that Molay died, proclaiming his innocence and calling on God to judge his persecutors. Legend grew quickly. Molay, it was said, cursed both Clement and Philip, summoning them before God within a year. Whether words or invention, the tale seemed vindicated. Clement died in April 1314, Philip in November. For many, this sealed the sense that divine justice had spoken where earthly courts had failed. The suppression of the Templars marked a turning point in medieval Europe. For the first time, a monarch had destroyed an international religious order, subordinating papal authority to royal will. The trial set precedents for using heresy charges as tools of state, for extracting confessions by torture, for seizing wealth under the cloak of piety. For the brothers who survived outside France, exile and dispersal followed. Some joined other orders, others lived quietly on pensions. Their white mantles vanished from battlefields, their rule dissolved by decree. But the memory of their sudden downfall, so dramatic, so brutal, ensured that the Templars would not fade into history quietly. They became legend, martyrs in the eyes of some, villains in the words of their accusers, mysteries in the imagination of generations to come, legacy and memory. The fires of March 1314 consumed Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, but they did not consume the memory of the order. If anything, the flames spread it. The Templars, stripped of their fortresses and scattered from their commanderies, began to live more powerfully in imagination than they ever had in stone. Their legacy did not end with their suppression. It transformed, seeping into politics, commerce, architecture, myth and folklore, becoming one of the most enduring stories of the Middle Ages. Survival in new guises. In the official record, the Pope's decree had dissolved the order, their properties transferred largely to the Hospitallers. Yet, the reality was more complicated. In Portugal, King Denis negotiated directly with the papacy, preserving Templar lands and personnel under a new title, the Order of Christ, 1319. The change was mostly cosmetic. Former Templars now wore different insignia, but continued to farm the same estates, guard the same roads, and operate the same administrative systems. 2 centuries later, when Prince Henry the Navigator assumed leadership of the Order of Christ, its wealth and discipline became the engine of Portugal's maritime expansion. Ships flying sails marked with the Red Cross, direct descendants of the Templar emblem, carried explorers along the African coast and eventually to the New World. Thus, what began as a frontier brotherhood in Palestine helped launch the Age of Discovery. In Aragon, a similar adaptation occurred. The papacy allowed Templar lands to pass into the newly created Order of Montesa, formed in 1317. Many former Templars found refuge there, transferring vows and experience into a new institution that carried forward the same martial religious character. In Castile, holdings were absorbed by the Order of Calatrava and the Order of Santiago, strengthening Spain's own crusading brotherhoods that fought the Reconquista until Granada fell in 1492. The white mantle was gone, but its spirit lived on in new colours and crests. Elsewhere in Europe, surviving brothers faded quietly into other orders or retired with pensions. In England, Edward II initially resisted the arrests but eventually complied with papal demands. Interrogations there, conducted without the brutality of French torture, uncovered little, and many English Templars spent the rest of their lives in monasteries. In Germany and Poland, suppression was uneven. Some brothers melted into the fabric of local knightly societies. In this patchwork afterlife, the order never wholly vanished, it dissolved into Europe's soil, its seeds sprouting in varied forms, enduring stones. Even where men disappeared, buildings endured. Round churches modelled on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem still stand in London, Paris, Tomar and other cities, their architecture instantly recognisable. In Portugal's Tomar, the Convent of Christ grew around a Templar core, layer upon layer of Gothic, Manueline and Renaissance architecture, bearing witness to centuries of adaptation. In Syria, ruins of fortresses like Safed, Chateau Pellerin, and Tortosa still scar the landscape. silent testimony to an age when white mantles patrolled their walls. Archaeological excavations reveal storage systems, workshops, cisterns, and defensive innovations, confirming the order's reputation for practical genius. These stones, weathered but unyielding, keep the Templars present in landscapes long after the Brotherhood itself was dispersed. Financial footprints. Perhaps their most influential legacy lay in finance. The Templars had pioneered tools of international banking, safe deposits, letters of credit, and trans-regional transfers of wealth. Pilgrims could leave coin in London and retrieve value in Acre without ever carrying a pouch of gold through dangerous roads. Kings deposited crowns in their vaults, confident in their security. These practices outlived the order, taken up by Italian merchant houses in Florence, Siena, and Venice, then by royal treasuries across Europe. The basic instruments of banking today, credit, deposit, transfer, owe part of their lineage to the counting houses of the Templars. Though their reputation as warrior monks overshadowed this quieter work, their methods reshaped the European economy. A dark precedent, their fall also left a shadowed legacy, the weaponization of heresy charges for political gain. Philip IV's use of accusation, torture, and show trials to eliminate the Templars established a pattern that would echo in later centuries. Witch hunts, inquisitorial purges, and state seizures of property often followed the same blueprint. Accuse, torture, extract confession, confiscate. In this sense, the Templars were not only victims of their age, but unwilling pioneers of its darkest judicial practices. Their destruction became a case study in how power could bend law into a blade. Legends of survival. Yet history alone could not contain them. From the 14th century onward, legends proliferated. In Scotland, where papal bulls carried less weight during the Wars of Independence, rumours spread that fugitive Templars aided Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, tipping the scales against English knights. In Switzerland, traditions claimed that refugees helped shape the early Confederacy's military discipline. In France, whispers told of treasure spirited away from Paris before the arrests. Gold, relics, even the Holy Grail. The very abruptness of their downfall invited speculation: how could so powerful an order simply vanish? Surely some fragments survived, some secret guarded. The most famous legend was the curse of Jacques de Molay. As flames rose on the Seine, chroniclers claimed he summoned Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God's judgment within the year. Both men died within months, Clement in April 1314, Philip in November. Whether coincidence or prophecy, the tale spread across Europe, cementing the Templars in popular imagination as martyrs vindicated by divine retribution. Mystics and Freemasons. Centuries later, the Templars found a new life in esoteric traditions. In the 18th century, the rising movement of Freemasonry wove them into its mythology. Higher degrees claimed descent from Templar wisdom, presenting the order as guardians of ancient secrets suppressed by tyrannical kings and popes. Templar crosses, rituals of knighthood, and stories of hidden knowledge became staples of Masonic lore. Serious historians found little evidence of direct continuity, but in the realm of symbol and imagination, the connection proved irresistible. The Templars became archetypes of lost wisdom, their downfall a parable of truth persecuted by power. Romantic revival and popular culture. The 19th century, with its medieval revival, cast the Templars in art, literature, and architecture. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe depicted them as villains, cruel and proud, while Romantic painters portrayed them as tragic figures, marching to martyrdom under banners of white and red. By the 20th century, they had become fixtures of pulp novels, conspiracy theories, and eventually films and video games. From Indiana Jones to Assassin's Creed, from the Da Vinci Code to countless documentaries, the Templars emerged as icons of mystery. They became a canvas for modern longings. Treasure hunters imagined their hoards, occultists their secrets, nationalists their survival in hidden refuges. Few medieval orders have been so thoroughly absorbed into modern imagination. The enduring paradox. Why do they endure? Perhaps because they embody paradox. They were monks who fought, warriors who prayed, poor men who controlled riches, obedient servants who defied kings. Their contradictions invite endless retelling because they mirror the contradictions of human life itself. Faith and power, discipline and corruption, courage and downfall. They remind us that institutions can be both noble and vulnerable, both disciplined and flawed. 7 centuries after their suppression, the white mantle still lingers in the mind's eye. Their castles dot landscapes, their financial innovations shape economies, their story fuels novels and legends. They were not perfect saints nor sinister conspirators, they were human beings in a unique experiment, one that bound prayer to sword and left a mark no flames could erase. The Templars' greatest legacy, perhaps, is this: that an order created to defend pilgrims on dusty roads came to shape the world far beyond those roads, not only in history, but in memory. Their name endures as a symbol, a mystery, and a reminder of how ideals, power, and fate intertwine. Iberian continuities and the Order of Christ. The suppression of the Templars across Europe did not follow a single pattern. The papal decree may have declared the order dissolved, but the enforcement of that decree depended on local rulers, their priorities, and their willingness to either preserve or erase what the knights had built. In France, where Philip IV orchestrated the downfall, the temple's properties were swiftly seized, their records confiscated, and their treasuries funneled into royal coffers. In England, interrogations produced little evidence, and most brothers faded quietly into monastic pensions. In the German lands, results were scattered and uneven, with some houses absorbed piecemeal into other institutions, but nowhere was the divergence more striking than in Iberia. There, the white mantle did not vanish. It shifted form, its fabric dyed with new colours, but its thread remained unbroken. Portugal, more than any other kingdom, provides the clearest example of this transformation. The Templars had been integral to Portuguese expansion since the 12th century, when Afonso Henrique, the first king, had granted them lands along the frontier to help secure newly won territories. Over generations, the order became custodians of critical castles and fertile estates, their fortresses like Tomar and Almirol anchoring Portugal's defensive line against incursions from the south. They were more than warriors. They built bridges, cleared lands, and drew settlers to regions that might otherwise have remained wasteland. By the early 14th century, their role was not incidental but foundational to the kingdom's stability. When the papacy ordered their dissolution in 1312, King Denis of Portugal faced a dilemma. To abolish the Templars outright would leave vast estates leaderless and frontier castles unmanned. To hand their properties to the Hospitallers, as papal bulls directed, would risk empowering a rival order not rooted in Portuguese soil. Denis instead proposed a compromise. He petitioned the Pope for permission to create a new military order, one that would inherit the Templar legacy in Portugal while appearing, at least formally, distinct. This solution preserved the country's defences while maintaining papal favour. The Pope agreed, and in 1319 the Order of Christ was born. The transformation was more cosmetic than real. Former Templars simply transferred their allegiance, their commanderies continued to function, and their fortresses remained occupied by men who had once worn the Red Cross. What changed was the banner under which they marched, and the authority to which they bowed. In essence, the Order of Christ was the Templars reborn, Portuguese in loyalty, papal in legitimacy, but unchanged in practice. The endurance of this institution had consequences far beyond Iberia. By the 15th century, as Muslim power waned in the peninsula, Portugal turned its energies toward the sea. The Order of Christ, flush with lands and revenues, became a crucial patron of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, appointed as its governor, directed its wealth into maritime ventures. Ships built with its funds sailed down the African coast, mapping shores and winds. Voyages financed in part by its coffers reached Madeira, the Azores, and eventually the Cape of Good Hope. The cross of the Order of Christ, descended directly from the Templar emblem, adorned the sails of caravels that crossed the Atlantic and entered the Indian Ocean. Thus, through this Portuguese reincarnation, the Templar legacy helped launch the Age of Discovery. In Aragon, a similar transformation occurred. The papacy approved the creation of the Order of Montesa in 1317, established to inherit Templar lands in Valencia. Here too, many former Templars found refuge. They exchanged their mantles but not their mission, continuing to defend frontier territories and serve their king. Montesa endured as a regional military order, smaller in scope than the Hospitallers or the Portuguese Order of Christ, but nevertheless a direct continuation of Templar discipline and organization. Castile chose a different route. There, existing military orders were strong and deeply entrenched: Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara. Rather than invent a new order, Castilian rulers absorbed Templar holdings into these pre-existing institutions. The infusion of land and property strengthened them, ensuring that the Reconquista would continue with renewed vigor. Former Templars, folded into these ranks, added experience and organizational skill. By the late 15th century, these orders were pillars of Castile's final campaigns against Granada, their combined resources fueling the armies that brought the Reconquista to its close in 1492. These Iberian continuities demonstrate a broader truth about the Templars. Suppression was not uniform annihilation, but a patchwork shaped by political calculation. In France, the order perished because a king desired its treasure, and a pope lacked the strength to resist him. In Iberia, rulers saw their practical utility and bent papal decrees to preserve them under new names. The result was not merely survival, but transformation. The Templars ceased to exist as a universal order, but in Iberia their essence endured first as guardians of frontier lands, then as patrons of exploration, ultimately as silent partners in the making of a global age. Thus, when we look at Portuguese caravels slicing through Atlantic waters under red crosses, or Spanish knights storming Granada's walls under banners inherited from Santiago and Calatrava, we are seeing echoes of the Templars. Their name was erased, but their work continued. The Iberian Peninsula, more than any other corner of Europe, ensured that the memory of the temple was not confined to legend or lamentation. Instead, it was woven into new institutions that carried their mission forward, transforming the legacy of warrior monks into the legacy of empire. Spain and the long Reconquista. While Portugal preserved the Templar legacy through the Order of Christ, the broader Iberian Peninsula became the stage on which the Templar inheritance merged with the great unfinished struggle of medieval Spain, the Reconquista. For centuries, Christian kingdoms of the north, Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, had pressed southward against Muslim Al-Andalus. It was a campaign not of swift conquest, but of grinding attrition, measured in castles captured, valleys repopulated, and frontiers fortified. The Templars had played their part since the 12th century, holding estates, raising fortresses, and securing territories on the shifting border. Their sudden suppression in 1312 could have created a vacuum. Instead, their lands and men were absorbed into Spain's existing military orders, ensuring that their experience, discipline, and resources were not lost, but folded into the fabric of Iberia's long, holy war. The Order of Santiago, founded in 1170, already commanded wide influence before the Templars' fall. Dedicated to Saint James the Apostle, Spain's patron and symbol of Christian resistance, Santiago Knights wore white mantles emblazoned with a red cross shaped like a sword. Their mission was both martial and spiritual, to defend pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela and to fight Muslims along the frontier. When Templar estates became available after 1312, Santiago absorbed many, expanding its reach across Castile and Leon. Former Templars found a natural home here, their vows redirected into a kindred institution that shared their ethos of faith and arms. The Order of Calatrava, born in 1158 from the Cistercian monastic tradition, likewise gained from the Templars' dissolution. Calatrava's knights had long defended central Spain, particularly the fortress of Calatrava la Vieja on the Guadiana River. Their discipline was austere, their connection to the Cistercians deep, their military effectiveness proven. With the absorption of Templar properties, they gained not only land but also manpower. This strengthened their ability to garrison frontier castles, fortify roads, and support royal campaigns. The Order of Alcantara, established in 1176, similarly expanded. Based along the Tagus River, Alcantara had been a smaller order, but the infusion of Templar resources helped cement its role as a regional power. Together, Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara became the triumvirate of Castilian military orders, blending the Templars' inheritance into their own traditions and using it to push the Reconquista forward. The Reconquista was not a single war but a centuries-long series of campaigns, punctuated by truces, alliances, and shifting politics. By the 14th century, Christian kingdoms controlled most of Iberia. Only the Nasrid Emirate of Granada remained, a glittering but fragile remnant of Muslim Spain, clinging to the southern mountains and fortified cities. The military orders became crucial tools in the final phase of this struggle. They provided disciplined cavalry, fortified frontier towns, and ensured that every push southward left behind not empty land but structured society. Templar castles became part of this system. Many were not abandoned after 1312, but reassigned to Santiago or Calatrava. Their walls continued to guard valleys. Their commanderies continued to supply grain and men. The white mantle had vanished, but the discipline it had represented lived on in new banners. In this way, the Reconquista was as much about continuity as conquest. The 15th century brought the decisive phase. Under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, united crowns launched a coordinated campaign against Granada. Military orders marched at their side, providing not only troops but logistical infrastructure. Former Templar estates, now controlled by Santiago or Calatrava, poured resources into the war chest. The long attrition accelerated into final conquest. In 1492, Granada surrendered, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain. The victory of 1492 carried layered symbolism. It marked the completion of the Reconquista, the consolidation of Spain under a united monarchy, and the culmination of centuries of crusading zeal. It also demonstrated the enduring impact of the Templar inheritance. The orders that had absorbed their lands and traditions played indispensable roles in the victory. Without their fortified networks, disciplined knights, and economic resources, the campaign might have dragged on longer or faltered altogether. Yet the Reconquista also marked a turning point. With Granada subdued, the military orders faced the same existential question that had confronted the Templars after Acre. What purpose remained when the frontier was gone? For a time, they adapted by supporting Spain's imperial ambitions. Santiago and Calatrava became integrated into the machinery of the crown, their revenues redirected toward exploration, colonization, and administration. In effect, Spain followed the path of Portugal, turning military religious orders into instruments of overseas expansion. In this transformation, the Templar spirit endured. Though their name was erased, their DNA survived in Iberia's institutions. The strict discipline of Santiago and Calatrava, the vast landed wealth they administered, the dual vocation of soldier and monk, all bore the imprint of the Templars. When Spanish caravels crossed the Atlantic, when conquistadors marched under banners of the cross, they carried with them the institutional memory of an order once founded in Jerusalem. Thus, the Reconquista did not simply end the story of the Templars in Iberia, it extended it. Their castles and estates became part of the foundation on which Spain built its empire. Their heirs, dressed in new mantles, rode not only against Granada but across oceans, spreading Europe's reach into new worlds. What began as the defense of pilgrims on dangerous roads ended, centuries later, as global conquest. And behind it all, hidden but persistent, was the continuity of an order that refused to vanish, even in suppression. Hospital as ascendant. With the Templars suppressed and their mantles stripped away, another order stepped into the vacuum. The Hospitallers, officially the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, had long been the Templars' rivals, brothers in arms, but also competitors for influence, resources, and prestige. Where the Templars had embodied the fusion of monasticism and knightly warfare, the Hospitallers had begun as caregivers, monks tending the sick at a hospice in Jerusalem during the First Crusade, before gradually taking up arms to defend their patients and properties. By the 14th century, their evolution into a military order was complete, and with the Templars gone, they inherited not only lands, but also responsibility for Christian defense in the Mediterranean. Papal bulls had declared that Templar properties would be transferred to the Hospitallers. In practice, this transfer was patchy and uneven. In France, Philip IV and his heirs kept much of the treasure for themselves, claiming debts owed to the crown. In England, much was absorbed by the monarchy before trickling into Hospitaller hands. In Iberia, as seen, new local orders like Christ and Montesa diverted the inheritance. But across much of Central and Southern Europe, the Hospitallers gained commanderies, estates, and castles once owned by the Temple. The absorption strengthened their wealth enormously, transforming them into the single most powerful military order of the late Middle Ages. The Hospitallers also inherited the Templars' strategic burden. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the Latin East was lost, but the Mediterranean still stood as a frontier against Muslim power. The Hospitallers understood this and repositioned themselves accordingly. In 1310, less than a decade after the Templars' suppression, they seized the island of Rhodes. This conquest was more than opportunistic, it was visionary. Rhodes offered a defensible base, a harbour, and a gateway between Europe and the Levant. From here, the Hospitallers built a maritime fortress state, a Christian bastion at the edge of an Islamic sea. The Knights of Rhodes became heirs to the Templar role as guardians of Christendom's frontier. Their fortress city rose with massive walls, harbours lined with war galleys, and hospitals that preserved their original vocation. They became both warriors and administrators, training men, minting coins, enforcing law, and maintaining an international network of estates that funneled resources toward their island stronghold. For 2 centuries, Rhodes stood as their citadel. From its harbours, Hospitaller galleys harried Ottoman fleets, disrupted Muslim trade routes, and escorted Christian pilgrims. They became the Mediterranean's watchmen, feared corsairs to their enemies, protectors to their allies. Their naval strength distinguished them from the Templars, whose power had always rested more on cavalry and castles than on ships. But the Hospitallers did not only inherit Templar strength, they also inherited their precariousness. Like the Templars, they depended on European support, and like the Templars, they faced enemies far stronger and more numerous. The Ottoman Turks, rising in power, encircled Rhodes through their expanding empire. By the early 16th century, the Great Storm arrived. In 1522, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent besieged Rhodes with an army numbering perhaps 100,000 against only a few thousand defenders. The Hospitallers resisted for months, their walls scarred by bombardments, their ranks thinned by disease and exhaustion. At last, recognizing further resistance would annihilate the civilian population, the Hospitallers negotiated honorable surrender. They evacuated with their banners, their archives, and their remaining galleys intact. From Rhodes, they moved to Malta, granted by Emperor Charles V in 1530. Here they became the Knights of Malta, a name that still endures. In Malta, they reached their zenith. Their fortifications at Valletta withstood the great siege of 1565, when once again Ottoman forces sought to crush them. Against overwhelming odds, the Hospitallers held firm, their defense celebrated across Europe as a triumph of courage and faith. The Hospitallers' trajectory reveals how the Templar inheritance did not vanish but flowed into new channels. They carried forward the model of the military order. International membership, vast landed wealth, spiritual vows harnessed to martial discipline. They added to this a new maritime vocation, becoming the Christian world's shield upon the sea. The contrast with the Templars is stark. Where the Templars perished in flames, the Hospitallers endured, adapting from Jerusalem to Rhodes to Malta, and eventually into a modern humanitarian organization, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, that still exists today. This longevity underscores how fragile the Templars' position had been, dependent on both their mission in the East and their political standing in Europe. When that mission collapsed and their enemies moved against them, they had no refuge. The Hospitallers, by contrast, shifted missions, shifted bases, and survived. Yet in their survival, the Hospitallers also preserved the memory of their fallen rivals. When they took over former Templar commanderies, they often preserved chapels, maintained records, and kept the estates running much as before. In some places, local memory blurred, and peasants continued calling a castle the temple long after the Hospitallers had taken possession. In this way, the Hospitallers became both heirs and custodians of the Templar legacy, ensuring that even as an institution the temple vanished, its imprint remained visible in Europe's landscape. Thus, as the 14th century gave way to the 15th and 16th, the map of Christian military orders had been redrawn. The Templars were gone, their flame extinguished. But the Hospitallers burned on, their light coloured by Templar inheritance. In Malta's bastions, in Rhodes' harbours, in European commanderies, the Templars lived indirectly, their legacy transmuted into another order's enduring power. Myth, memory, and the curse of Jacques de Molay. When the pyres were lit on that cold March evening in 1314, and the flames curled upward over the Seine, Paris bore witness not just to the death of two men, but to the beginning of something that would outlive the very institutions that had condemned them. Jacques de Molay, the Grandmaster of the Temple, and Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, stood bound to the stakes, their white mantles stripped from their shoulders, their faces weathered by years of confinement. As the fire climbed, they cried out not in despair, but in defiance. Chroniclers tell us that de Molay proclaimed his innocence, declared the order pure, and called upon Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to appear before God's judgment within the year. Whether the exact words were uttered or not, the prophecy seemed fulfilled when Clement died in April and Philip in November. In the eyes of many, this was no coincidence but divine vengeance, a heavenly verdict against earthly injustice. Thus was born the most famous of all Templar legends, the curse of Jacques de Molay. The power of that legend lay in its timing. Europe in the early 14th century was a society steeped in symbolism. Fire was not only a punishment, it was purification. To speak prophecy from within the flames was to turn execution into transfiguration. De Molay, once a prisoner accused of blasphemy, became in death a prophet. The narrative spread quickly through taverns, markets, monasteries, and noble courts. The Templars, destroyed by royal decree, were resurrected in imagination as martyrs whose final words toppled kings and popes. It was not the end of their story, it was its rebirth. From this moment, the Templars slipped beyond the grasp of the jurists who had condemned them. They belonged to memory, and memory is not bound by parchment or decree. In Scotland, whispers circulated that Templar fugitives had fled across the Channel to find refuge with Robert the Bruce. The king, himself excommunicated, welcomed all who opposed papal authority. Some claimed that at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, shadowy knights clad in white had charged at the decisive moment, scattering the English. Whether truth or invention, the story took root. For generations, Scots imagined the Templars as secret allies of their independence, guardians of liberty against foreign rule. In Switzerland, too, rumours blossomed. The disciplined infantry of the early Swiss Confederacy, who defied the mounted knights of Austria at Morgarten and Sempach, were sometimes said to have inherited their training from fugitive Templars. The image of the poor knights, stripped of wealth but rich in discipline, fit neatly into Swiss self-identity, simple men standing firm against tyranny. Again, the evidence is thin, but the myth was stronger than documentation. Elsewhere in Europe, the legends turned inward toward mystery. The suddenness of the arrests in 1307 left unanswered questions. What had happened to the order's immense treasure, the gold and silver stored in the Paris Temple, the revenues flowing from estates across Christendom? Royal inventories after the suppression revealed far less than rumour suggested. From this gap in the record emerged tales of hidden wealth spirited away before the king's men arrived. Treasures carted secretly to the coast, loaded onto ships that vanished into the Atlantic night. Some claimed the fleet had sailed to Scotland, others to Portugal, still others to unknown islands beyond the horizon. Over time, the treasure became more than coin. It became the Holy Grail itself, the Ark of the Covenant, sacred relics guarded by the temple in secret vaults. Medieval imagination, hungry for mysteries, filled every silence with wonder. The accusation of idol worship, once a weapon wielded against the Templars, was reimagined by later centuries into another dimension of their legend, the mysterious head called Baphomet, which inquisitors used as evidence of heresy, became an enigma that fascinated alchemists, occultists, and romantics. Was it a corruption of Mahomet, a slander accusing them of Islamic sympathies? Was it an ancient Gnostic symbol, or a relic containing secret wisdom? Whatever the answer, it fueled centuries of speculation. For esoteric thinkers, the Templars were no longer condemned heretics but misunderstood keepers of arcane truths. By the Renaissance, antiquarians sought their ruins, marveling at their round churches modelled on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Writers speculated about their role in history, linking them to ancient wisdom or hidden sciences. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as Europe's fascination with secret societies grew, the Templars became central to Masonic lore. Higher degrees of Freemasonry styled themselves Knights Templar, claiming symbolic descent from the order. Rituals invoked their memory, presenting them as guardians of a wisdom betrayed by kings, but preserved in secrecy. Though historically false, these rituals enshrined the Templars as archetypes of eternal brotherhood and martyrdom. The Romantic movement of the 19th century revived them once more, this time on the stage of literature and painting. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe cast them as villains, proud, corrupt, menacing, but in doing so ensured their place in popular culture. Artists painted them in tragic hues, marching solemnly to martyrdom, their castles silhouetted against stormy skies. Tourists visited ruined commanderies, standing in round churches and imagining themselves in the footsteps of ghostly knights. The Templars became symbols of a lost chivalry, tinged with mystery, tragedy, and awe. The 20th and 21st centuries expanded their legend beyond measure. Novels like The Da Vinci Code recast them as guardians of secrets that could shake Christianity itself. Films and video games transformed them into conspirators, treasure keepers, or eternal adversaries. Documentaries probed their banking systems, their castles, their supposed voyages to the New World. The Templars had become not merely a historical order, but a cultural archetype, a canvas on which every generation projected its own hopes and fears. Guardians of holy relics, architects of hidden empires, keepers of forbidden knowledge. And yet, beneath the layers of myth, the historical Templars remain compelling. They were neither saints nor sorcerers, but human beings who attempted something extraordinary: to live as monks and fight as knights, to bind prayer to the sword, to build a transnational institution in an age of feudal fragmentation. They were disciplined, wealthy, flawed, courageous, and vulnerable. Their downfall was not the work of demons or curses, but of kings and politics. Yet their endurance in memory, in legend, in culture, suggests that their real legacy is not in what they held, but in what they represented. The myth of Jacques de Molay's curse captures this paradox perfectly. Whether or not he truly spoke those words, Europe believed he had. The idea that an unjustly condemned knight could summon divine judgment on pope and king resonated far more deeply than the technicalities of their trial. It crystallized the Templars as victims, as martyrs, as symbols of resistance against corrupt power. From that moment onward, they belonged less to history than to imagination. 7 centuries later, the red cross on white still stirs the mind. In ruins and romances, in rituals and conspiracies, the Templars live. Their castles crumble, their archives moulder, but their legend thrives. They remain what they became in 1314. An unfinished story, half fact, half fable, impossible to silence, impossible to forget. Stones, fortresses, and the architectural legacy. If the flames of Paris reduced the brothers of the Temple to ash, the stones they raised remained. Across Europe and the Levant, their fortresses, churches, and commanderies endured long after the order was dissolved, their massive walls and distinctive forms standing as silent witnesses to 2 centuries of discipline, wealth, and vision. Where parchments burned and treasure vanished, the buildings themselves told the story of an institution that knew how to root itself in stone as firmly as in prayer. The most iconic of these structures were the Templar castles of the Holy Land. Built in a region where survival depended on fortification, they were marvels of medieval engineering. At Safed, perched high above Galilee, the order constructed a fortress whose walls stretched nearly a kilometre, bristling with towers, cisterns, and concentric defences. At Tortosa, on the Syrian coast, they reinforced Byzantine foundations with towers so thick that even trebuchet stones could not easily shatter them. The mighty Chateau Pellerin, also known as Atlit, was perhaps their greatest masterpiece, a coastal fortress whose curtain walls and deep moat faced both sea and land, a bastion so formidable that even the relentless forces of Sultan Baybars hesitated before it. Though ultimately abandoned after the fall of Acre, its ruins still dominate the landscape, a monument to a time when the Templars were not merely warriors but architects of resilience. In Europe, their castles served less as frontier citadels than as command centres. Here too the Templar touch is evident. Practical layouts, solid defences, integration of chapel, dormitory, refectory, and stables into a compact whole. Many were situated on trade routes, both to protect and to profit from commerce. In England, strongholds like Temple Balsall and the Preceptory at Bristol controlled roads and ports. In France, commanderies dotted the countryside, their chapels often the most enduring element, outlasting barns and dormitories. In Spain and Portugal, frontier castles like Almirall, perched on its rocky island in the Tagus, and Tomar, the jewel of Portuguese Templar architecture, still rise with an almost dreamlike presence above the rivers and hills they once guarded. Tomar deserves special attention, for it is here that the Templar architectural legacy was not only preserved but transformed. Founded in the 12th century as the headquarters of the Templars in Portugal, Tomar's centerpiece was the round church, modelled directly on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. With its octagonal nave, soaring arches, and richly painted interior, it symbolized the fusion of sacred and martial that defined the order. When the Templars became the Order of Christ, Tomar expanded into a vast convent, its cloisters and chapter houses layered with Gothic, Manueline, and Renaissance styles. To walk through Tomar today is to walk through centuries of history, the original Templar vision preserved beneath later flourishes, a palimpsest of stone. The round churches of the Templars form another distinctive legacy. Inspired by the rotunda of Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, they were unique in Western Europe, marking Templar sites with unmistakable symbolism. The Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185, remains one of the finest examples. A circular nave surrounded by stone effigies of knights, its worn figures lying in eternal repose beneath vaulted ceilings. In Paris, the great temple complex, long since demolished, was once crowned by a round church of equal grandeur. In Spain, Segovia's Vera Cruz Church echoes the same design. These circles, evoking eternity and resurrection, reminded both brothers and pilgrims of the order's origins in the East, embedding Jerusalem itself into European soil. The Templars also left their mark through practical infrastructure. Their estates were not only fortresses but centers of economic activity. Archaeological excavations of rural commanderies in France and Hungary have revealed water mills, wine presses, and barns, arranged with efficiency that foreshadowed later estate management. Irrigation systems uncovered in Portuguese holdings demonstrate advanced hydraulic engineering, bringing fertility to lands once barren. Bridges constructed under their supervision facilitated not only military movement but civilian travel, cementing their role as builders of society as well as guardians of faith. Even in ruin, Templar architecture carries a particular aura. The massive stones of Safed and Tortosa, tumbled by siege and time, seem to whisper of last stands and silent prayers. The solitary tower of Almirol, reflected in the Tagus, evokes both isolation and watchfulness. The worn effigies of knights in the Temple Church in London, hands crossed, swords by their sides, convey a serenity that belies the tumult of their history. These stones became more than remnants. They became symbols, anchors for memory and imagination. Over centuries, many of these sites were repurposed. Hospitallers took possession of fortresses, monarchs seized castles, towns grew around former commanderies, yet in the popular imagination the stones remained Templar. Peasants continued to call fields the Temple's land, even when owned by others. Travelers wove stories of secret tunnels, hidden vaults, or spectral knights haunting the ruins. Architects of later ages borrowed their imagery, incorporating round naves, austere chapels, and crenellated towers into churches and civic buildings. In this way, the Templars' architectural legacy extended far beyond the Middle Ages. Their castles inspired the defensive designs of later fortresses. Their economic complexes foreshadowed the estate systems of Renaissance princes. Their round churches became icons of mystery, drawing antiquarians and tourists alike. And above all, their ruins became the stage upon which legend played. To stand in a Templar ruin was to feel history's weight, to imagine whispers of vows, clashes of swords, prayers sung in stone halls. Thus, even though the order perished by decree, their stones endured as their true testament. Where kings had sought to erase them, walls refused to fall. Where inquisitors had tried to brand them heretics, chapels continued to echo with sacred geometry. The Templars' architecture embodied their spirit, practical, disciplined, resilient, and infused with the sacred. It made their presence impossible to forget, for every tower and nave stood as a reminder that they had once reshaped landscapes with both sword and spade. Centuries later, When myth and romance enveloped the Templars, it was often these stones that gave legend its anchor. Treasure hunters dug beneath ruined castles, convinced of hidden vaults. Poets described round churches as gateways to mysteries. Tourists traced their fingers over effigies, imagining secrets carved into the stone. The architecture was not merely functional, it was symbolic, the durable skeleton of an order that otherwise dissolved into memory. In the end, the Templars left two legacies, one of legend, whispered in curses, treasures, and conspiracies, the other of stone, visible in towers, walls, and chapels. Together they ensured that the order would never vanish entirely. Fire consumed men, but stone endured, and through stone the Templars continued to shape both history and imagination long after their banners had been lowered. Financial innovations and the birth of banking. If the castles and churches of the Templars endure as their most visible legacy, their financial systems endure as their most invisible and perhaps their most influential. For while their towers dominated horizons and their mantles struck ore on the battlefield, it was their counting houses, their ledgers, their letters of credit, and their vaults that quietly transformed the European economy. The Templars were not theorists of finance. They did not write treatises on economics. Yet by necessity, by pragmatism, and by sheer organizational genius, they laid the foundations of international banking centuries before the rise of Florentine bankers and modern institutions. The origins of this financial role were practical. From the start, the Templars were entrusted with protecting pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. These travelers often carried wealth coins, jewelry, or donations to shrines which made them targets for bandits along the long, perilous routes. To solve this danger, the Templars developed a system that allowed a pilgrim to deposit funds at one Templar commandery in Europe and withdraw equivalent value in the Levant. It was simple in concept yet revolutionary in practice. The pilgrim was issued a written note, recognizable across the Templar network, which could be redeemed at another house. Thus was born one of the earliest known systems of bills of exchange, centuries before the word bank acquired its modern meaning. From this modest beginning, their financial role expanded rapidly. Kings and nobles, recognizing the efficiency and security of Templar administration, began entrusting them with greater responsibilities. The Order's commandery in Paris, known simply as the Temple, became one of Europe's most secure treasuries. Monarchs deposited their gold and jewels there, confident that the walls and vows of the Templars offered greater security than any palace vault. The kings of France, in particular, relied on the Temple, using it not only as a safe deposit but as a fiscal bureau. Taxes collected from across the realm passed through Templar hands. Payments to mercenaries and creditors were issued from their accounts. In effect, the Templars became the bankers of the Capetian monarchy. Their reach was international. With commanderies scattered from Ireland to Hungary, from Sicily to Scotland, they could move wealth across borders with unmatched speed and security. If a nobleman in Castile wished to fund a campaign in the Levant, he could deposit coin in Toledo and have it appear in Acre without ever sending a caravan across bandit-infested lands. If a king in England needed to pay a ransom in France, the Templars could arrange it with a stroke of the quill, not the risk of the road. Their international network functioned much like a proto-central bank, enabling liquidity in ways local treasuries could not. Documents from the 13th century reveal the sophistication of their practices. They understood exchange rates between currencies of different realms, English pennies, French livres, Italian florins, Byzantine hyperpyra, and adjusted accordingly. They grasped the dangers of debased coinage, protecting deposits from sudden fluctuations in value. They employed systems of auditing and accountability, with preceptors reporting to regional masters, who in turn reported to the Grandmaster. Their records show a clarity and order unusual for the Middle Ages, evidence of men who valued precision as much as piety. Their vaults were more than storerooms. Archaeological studies of Templar sites have uncovered evidence of standardized chests with multiple locks, designed so that no single brother could open them without others present. This prevented fraud and reinforced the principle of collective trust. In some commanderies, coins were sorted and stored by type, with careful tallies recorded in wax tablets or parchment rolls. Workshop remains reveal systems for minting tokens and tallies used in local transactions. The Templars had stumbled upon practices that would later define banking, transparency, security, and accountability. The Templars' financial acumen extended even into diplomacy and warfare. When Richard the Lionheart campaigned in the Holy Land, Templar treasuries helped sustain his armies. When papal legates needed funds for crusading efforts, the Templars acted as intermediaries, channeling donations collected in Northern Europe to the war fronts in the East. Their revenues from European estates, grain, wool, wine, rents were systematically gathered, converted into coin, and transferred to where they were needed. This financial pipeline gave them resilience. Even when castles fell or fields were burned, the wider network continued to provide, buffering the order from local catastrophe. It was precisely this wealth and independence, however, that bred envy. Secular rulers, especially those burdened by debt, began to resent the Templars' autonomy. They could raise and transfer sums more swiftly than monarchies themselves. They answered to the Pope, not to kings. They enjoyed exemptions from taxation that no lay institution could claim. To rulers like Philip IV of France, perpetually short of funds, the temple was not merely a partner but a rival one that could be destroyed to enrich the crown. And yet, even in their suppression, their financial practices endured. The Hospitallers adopted many of their methods. Italian merchant houses, such as the Bardi and Medici, expanded upon them, building banking empires that spanned Europe. Governments slowly began to emulate the Templars' fiscal discipline, centralizing treasuries and developing their own systems of credit. In this sense, the Templars were not the end but the beginning. Their abrupt destruction was tragic, but the model they had pioneered could not be erased. The irony is profound. An order founded to protect pilgrims ended up pioneering tools that protected wealth. Their swords defended roads, but their ledgers defended assets. Their castles crumbled, but their accounting methods flowed quietly into the bloodstream of European finance. Today, when one swipes a card in one country and sees money move instantly across borders, one echoes, unknowingly, a practice first shaped in the counting houses of the temple. Thus, their financial innovations are not a side note but a central legacy. The Templars were not merely warriors and monks. They were also architects of systems that outlasted their mantles. Their genius lay in making faith and practicality serve one another. In their churches, prayers rose toward heaven. In their treasuries, coins moved across continents. Together, these acts sustained an institution that shaped both the spiritual and material fabric of the Middle Ages, and whose shadow still lies across modern banking, invisible but indelible. The Templars, in cultural memory of later centuries. Long after their mantles were stripped and their commanderies confiscated, the Templars refused to vanish. Their stones endured in ruined castles, their innovations lived on in banking systems. But perhaps their most powerful afterlife lay in culture and imagination. From the moment Jacques de Molay cried out his innocence on the pyre, they were no longer simply a dissolved military order, they had become an emblem. Over the centuries, that emblem was painted, written, sung, and reimagined so many times that the Templars came to inhabit a space somewhere between history and myth. In the medieval and early Renaissance imagination, they were remembered with a blend of awe and suspicion. Chroniclers of the 14th century described them with tones of tragedy. Valiant defenders of the Holy Land, undone by treachery and politics. But there were also darker whispers, born from the accusations of their trial. Some believed they had indeed guarded forbidden secrets, hidden relics, or arcane rites. These shadows, cast by royal propaganda, lingered in the corners of memory, giving the Templars a mystique that more straightforward orders like the Hospitallers never possessed. By the 15th century, antiquarians and poets began to look back at the temple with fascination. Pilgrims to the Holy Land sought out ruins once held by them. In France and England, ruins of round churches were regarded with a kind of reverence tinged with curiosity, monuments to an age that felt both close and irretrievably distant. Ballads and local legends grew around them. In rural Europe, peasants pointed to ruined commanderies and spoke of hidden treasures buried beneath, guarded by the restless spirits of fallen knights. The Templars' sudden fall made them fertile ground for ghost stories and mystery tales. The 17th and 18th centuries transformed them further. In an age when secret societies captured imaginations, the Templars became symbols of hidden continuity. Freemasonry, emerging into public view in early 18th century England, drew on Templar imagery. Higher Masonic degrees styled themselves as Knights Templar, presenting rituals that claimed symbolic descent from the medieval order. Though historians found no real link, the symbolic power was irresistible. In these rituals, the Templars were portrayed not as heretics, but as martyrs betrayed by church and crown, yet guardians of an eternal wisdom that had survived underground. This reinvention resonated in an age fascinated by both chivalry and secrecy, and it ensured that the Templars' name would be carried forward in cultural memory even when history was forgotten. The Romantic age of the 19th century gave them new life again. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe cast the Templar Brian de Bois Guilbert as both villain and tragic figure, proud, ambitious, and fatally flawed. In doing so, Scott cemented the Templars in the literary imagination as embodiments of both nobility and corruption, martyrs and monsters. Painters across Europe depicted them in dramatic scenes, marching solemnly to execution, kneeling in ruined chapels, or riding into hopeless battle beneath crimson crosses. Round churches and ruined castles became tourist sites, and guidebooks wove fact with fable to satisfy the appetite of visitors hungry for mystery. In the popular mind, the Templars became avatars of a lost medieval world, men of iron faith and hidden knowledge, betrayed by kings yet immortalized in stone. The 20th century layered even more onto their legend. As modern societies grew fascinated with conspiracies, lost treasures, and secret wisdom, the Templars emerged as the perfect vessel. Stories claimed they had guarded the Holy Grail, that they had discovered relics beneath Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, that they had fled to Scotland or Switzerland with treasure and knowledge intact. Treasure hunters scoured the ruins of France and Portugal. Novelists and filmmakers turned them into guardians of secrets capable of reshaping history. By the 21st century, the Templars had become ubiquitous in popular culture. Films like Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade invoked them as keepers of the Grail. Video games, such as Assassin's Creed, transformed them into shadowy conspirators, eternal adversaries controlling empires in secrecy. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code popularized them as custodians of forbidden truths about Christianity itself. Historical documentaries multiplied, some sober and others speculative, tracing their legacy from Jerusalem to America, from Acre to Oak Island. In the modern imagination, they became less a medieval order and more a cultural archetype, the secretive brotherhood, half sacred, half sinister, always guarding something too great for the world to know. And yet, through all of these transformations, the real Templars have not disappeared. Scholars in archives continue to pore over their trial records, their financial ledgers, their architectural remains. Archaeologists uncover cisterns, chapels, and storerooms that reveal their daily life. Historians reconstruct their rules and their rhythms, showing them not as wizards or villains, but as men of flesh and faith who sought to live by vows of poverty and discipline, and who built something extraordinary in the process. It is this tension between sober history and wild imagination that has given the Templars their enduring place in cultural memory. Few other medieval institutions inspire such fascination 7 centuries later. The Hospitallers survived, the Teutonic Knights evolved, but it is the Templars, cut short by fire and decree, who live on most vividly. Their very destruction gave them power, for it left behind questions without answers, silences into which legend rushed. The Templars' cultural memory is therefore twofold. On one side lies the historical brotherhood, monks and knights who prayed, trained, built, farmed, and fought, who managed estates and treasuries with discipline, who died at Acre and Hattin and Paris. On the other lies the myth, guardians of grails, keepers of secrets, victims of curses, conspirators in the shadows. Between them lies the enduring paradox of the temple, at once utterly human and impossibly legendary. And so, centuries after Jacques de Molay's cry faded on the night air of Paris, the world still speaks of his order. Not as a closed chapter, but as an eternal story, part history, part legend, part imagination. The Templars became immortal not through survival, but through memory. The curse of the Grandmaster. On the 18th of March, 1314, Paris gathered to watch the end of an age. The sun was sinking as 2 prisoners were led across the Ile de la Cité toward a wooden platform stacked high with kindling. The city, long accustomed to spectacles of justice, murmured with anticipation. But this was no ordinary execution. These were no common criminals. The men who shuffled forward in chains were the last leaders of the most powerful military order Christendom had ever known. At the head walked Jacques de Molay, Grandmaster of the Knights Templar, a man well into his 70s. His beard, long and grey, swayed in the evening air, his face lined by years of confinement and interrogation. Beside him came Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, younger but equally marked by suffering. Both had endured nearly 7 years of humiliation since their sudden arrest on that infamous October morning in 1307, when Philip IV's soldiers had stormed every Templar house in France at once. They had been paraded before inquisitors, tortured, forced into confessions, and then condemned as heretics. Now, they would die by fire. The square was packed. Merchants, nobles, clerics, and common folk all pressed forward to witness the destruction of the order that had once carried Christ's banner into the Holy Land and stored the treasures of kings in its vaults. Many had admired the Templars in years past for their discipline, their courage, and their service. Others, poisoned by rumour and royal propaganda, believed the lurid accusations of idolatry, blasphemy, and corruption. Still others came simply to see a spectacle, the fall of giants, a drama of power and betrayal enacted in fire. The executioners bound the prisoners to the stakes and lit the torches. Flames licked upward, sparks snapping in the evening air. But before the crowd's eyes, Jacques de Molay did something no one expected. Instead of begging mercy or retreating into silence, the Grandmaster raised his voice. Chroniclers would later dispute the exact wording, but all agreed that his cry was unforgettable. He declared that the Templars were innocent. He insisted that his confession of guilt had been torn from him by pain and fear, not by truth. He proclaimed that the order had been loyal to Christ and the Church, betrayed only by greed and the malice of men. And then came the words that would echo across centuries. Jacques de Molay, standing in the fire, turned his gaze to the men most responsible for the destruction of his order. Pope Clement V, who had sanctioned the trials and decrees, and King Philip IV of France, who had orchestrated the entire affair for his own gain. With the flames climbing higher, de Molay shouted that he summoned both Pope and King to appear with him before the tribunal of God within the year. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was more than defiance. It was prophecy. To condemn one's earthly judges was bold enough, But to call them to divine judgment on a fixed timetable was something else entirely. This was not merely the last cry of a broken man, it was a curse hurled across the heavens. The executioners tightened their work. The smoke thickened, the flames roared. De Molay's voice faded only when the fire consumed him. The curse took on life almost immediately. Within weeks, news spread that Pope Clement V was dead. He died in April 1314, stricken by illness, barely a month after the pyre was lit. That same spring, as his body was prepared for burial, lightning struck the church where his remains lay in state, igniting a fire that destroyed the building. Chroniclers could not resist linking the flames that consumed Clement's church to the flames that had consumed the Grandmaster. By the end of the year, King Philip IV too was gone. In November 1314, while hunting in the forest of Fontainebleau, he suffered a sudden stroke after being thrown from his horse. He lingered briefly, then died at the age of 46. To contemporaries, this was no coincidence. The curse had claimed both Pope and King exactly as de Molay had foretold. From Paris to Avignon, from London to Rome, the story raced along every road and river. Chroniclers wrote of it in awe, some insisting it was divine justice, others whispering it was the devil's vengeance. Ordinary people repeated the tale with relish, that a dying knight had summoned two of Christendom's greatest rulers to the judgment seat of God, and that heaven had answered. The curse became part of European folklore almost overnight. The sudden deaths of Clement and Philip reshaped how the trials were remembered. What had begun as a campaign to discredit and destroy the Templars now seemed to many like a cosmic drama. The execution was not the triumph of a king, but his undoing. The papal bull of suppression was no longer a final verdict, but evidence of papal weakness. The fire that was meant to silence the Templars instead turned them into martyrs, their innocence confirmed in the eyes of countless observers, not by courts but by heaven itself. Over time, the curse of the Templars grew in the telling. Some accounts embellished the Grandmaster's words, turning them into a sweeping prophecy that condemned not only Pope and King, but their entire lines. Later generations even claimed that de Molay cursed the French royal dynasty, pointing to the disasters that befell Philip's heirs, the so-called accursed kings, 3 sons who each reigned briefly and died without lasting legacy, ushering France into the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Though historians today see coincidence, the medieval mind saw divine retribution. Thus, Jacques de Molay, burned as a heretic, emerged in memory as a prophet of vengeance. His final words transformed a political execution into a myth of cosmic justice. For many across Christendom, the Templars were no longer disgraced soldiers, but holy victims vindicated by God himself. And in that transformation lay the seed of their immortality. For where law and decree had failed them, legend gave them eternal life. The Freemason connection. The story of the Templars might have ended in the flames of Paris, their castles stripped, their wealth seized, their brothers scattered into obscurity. Yet centuries later, in the quiet chambers of European lodges lit by candlelight, their name was spoken again, not in trials or condemnations, but in oaths of fraternity. The Templars were reborn, not as soldiers or monks, but as symbols. Their second life emerged through the Freemasons, who in the 17th and 18th centuries became one of the most influential fraternal movements in Europe and beyond. To understand why the Masons embraced the Templar image, we must first understand the cultural climate of the Enlightenment. Europe was changing. Monarchs and popes still held great power, but new ideas about liberty, fraternity, and reason were spreading through salons, academies, and secret societies. The Freemasons, evolving from medieval craft guilds into philosophical brotherhoods, prized ritual, symbolism, and mythic lineage. They were not content to be seen merely as social clubs. They sought ancient roots, timeless traditions, and stories that elevated their identity. In the ruined memory of the Templars, they found exactly what they needed. The parallels were irresistible. The Templars were a brotherhood bound by vows, shrouded in secrecy, devoted to a cause greater than themselves. They were also victims of betrayal by worldly powers, destroyed by a king and a pope who feared their independence. To 18th century Freemasons, often accused by authorities of being subversive themselves, the Templars represented a powerful mirror, men of discipline and loyalty crushed by tyranny, yet vindicated in memory. By adopting their symbols, the Freemasons could claim continuity with a lineage of honor, martyrdom, and hidden wisdom. By the mid-1700 seconds, Masonic rites explicitly invoked the Templars. New, higher degrees were created, beyond the traditional craft levels, in which initiates symbolically became Knights Templar. Ceremonies dramatized the destruction of the temple and the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay. Candidates donned mantles marked with the Red Cross, took up ceremonial swords, and pledged themselves to defend truth and justice as heirs of the fallen knights. The rituals were theatrical, yes, but also deeply symbolic. To become a Templar in the lodge was to embody loyalty to principles that transcended earthly powers. Paintings and engravings of the era captured this fascination. Artists portrayed de Molay not as a heretic but as a martyr, bound to the stake, his eyes lifted toward heaven while kings and popes cowered in shame. Writers and philosophers used the Templars as symbols in debates about church and state. In France especially, where memories of Philip IV's tyranny still lingered, the Templars became icons of resistance against corrupt authority. Their destruction was recast, not as a stain, but as a badge of honor, a lesson in the dangers of unchecked power. The connection spread beyond Europe. In the young United States, where Freemasonry flourished among the founding fathers, the Templar image resonated with Republican ideals. George Washington himself was a Mason, and though not part of the Templar degree, the association of knightly virtue with the new nation was powerful. American Masons organized Templar encampments, parading in uniforms adorned with crosses, swords, and banners. In these processions, the memory of Crusader knights merged with the civic pride of a new republic. The white mantle, once feared in battle, became a symbol of civic brotherhood on American streets. But it was not only politics. The Templar image also appealed to the mystical imagination of the 18th and 19th centuries. Rumors persisted that the order had possessed secret knowledge uncovered in Jerusalem, esoteric wisdom buried beneath the Temple of Solomon itself. Freemason writers wove these rumors into elaborate theories, claiming that the Templars had preserved hidden truths, perhaps Gnostic, perhaps alchemical, which were passed on in secret after their suppression. Some even argued that the Freemasons were the direct heirs of the order, a hidden continuation of a brotherhood that had never truly died. Historians know this is not the case. There is no documentary evidence that the Templars survived underground and resurfaced as Freemasons. The link is mythic, not historical. But myth can be more powerful than fact. For generations of Freemasons, and for the wider culture that looked upon them, the Templar connection gave depth and dignity to their rituals. It made every meeting in a candlelit lodge feel like a continuation of a struggle that had begun in Jerusalem, carried through the flames of Paris, and endured into their own age. The Freemason-Templar connection also ensured that the Knights' memory would not fade into dusty chronicles. It kept them alive in art, ceremony, and imagination. When later generations spoke of the Templars, they did not remember only Acre or Hattin, castles or treasuries. They remembered also the vision created by the Masons, the Templar as eternal knight, standing against tyranny, keeper of secrets, martyr of truth. By the close of the 18th century, the Templars existed in two parallel worlds. In the archives, scholars sifted through papal bulls and trial records, reconstructing the history of a medieval order. But in the lodges of Europe and America, men in regalia raised their swords in candlelit chambers and proclaimed themselves heirs of Jacques de Molay, the first preserved history, the second preserved legend. And in many ways, it was the legend that proved more enduring, for it gave the Templars a second life in the cultural bloodstream of the modern world. Thus, the Freemason connection was not merely a curiosity, it was a resurrection. From the ashes of suppression, the Templars were reborn in symbol and ritual, carried into an age of enlightenment and revolution. They no longer marched as warriors or monks, but as myths embodied by men who longed for noble ancestry and found it in the white mantle and red cross. The Masons did not give the Templars back their castles, but they gave them something even more enduring: immortality in imagination. Romantic revival. The 19th century was an age of iron and steam, of revolutions and factories, but also of yearning for a world that seemed nobler, more mysterious, more rooted in faith and tragedy than the modern age could provide. This yearning found its expression in the Romantic movement, a tide of literature, art, and philosophy that swept across Europe and beyond. Poets and painters turned to ruins with reverence, novelists to legends with longing, historians to the Middle Ages with new fascination. Among the many figures revived in this romantic gaze, none captured the imagination more completely than the Knights Templar. For centuries, the Templars had been remembered with suspicion, their destruction coloured by accusations of heresy. In dusty chronicles, they were still recorded as men burned for idolatry. But by the time of the Romantics, the memory of Philip IV and Pope Clement had faded, while the aura of mystery around the Templars remained. They were no longer bound to papal bulls or royal edicts. They were free to be recast by imagination. And imagination did not hesitate. Painters were among the first to give them new life. In French salons, British academies, and German ateliers, artists presented the Templars as martyrs, their bodies bathed in the orange glow of fire, their faces calm and defiant against their accusers. Jacques de Molay became an icon of tragic resistance. Eugène Delacroix depicted knights as luminous figures, their mantles stark white against a sea of shadow, their crosses glowing like embers. Francisco de Goya, in his darker visions, evoked the anguish of trial and torture. Others painted them in battle shields locked, banners snapping in the wind, charging against impossible odds. In these canvases, they were not heretics but heroes, doomed but exalted. Poets added their voices. Across Europe, verses mourned the last of the temple, sung of ruins echoing with forgotten prayers, and lamented the fall of men who had once defended Christendom. The Templars became symbols of betrayed faith, of loyalty crushed by corruption. Some poets linked them to the Grail legend, imagining that the order had been custodians of Christ's chalice, guardians of mysteries too holy or too dangerous for kings to control. The Grail, never mentioned in the trials, became entwined with their name in the Romantic imagination. And then came the novelists, whose pens carried the Templars into the hands of thousands. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, published in 1819, was a sensation. Its Templar villain, Briand de Bois Guilbert, was no simple caricature but a man torn by ambition, desire, and faith. Though portrayed as cruel, he was also magnetic, embodying both menace and tragic grandeur. Scott's novel ensured that the Templars would forever haunt the landscape of popular fiction, not merely as monks or knights, but as complex figures standing between light and shadow. Other writers soon followed. In Germany, France, and Spain, novels reimagined the order as keepers of hidden treasures, participants in secret rituals, or victims of conspiracies reaching far beyond the medieval world. At the same time, travelers and antiquarians began rediscovering the physical remnants of the order. The Temple Church in London, once a place of sober worship, became a tourist site, its round nave admired for its austere beauty and its recumbent nightly effigies. Guidebooks lingered on the carved stone figures, knights with crossed legs, swords at their sides, frozen in eternal vigil. In France, visitors sketched the ruins of Templar commanderies, imagining secret chambers beneath their floors. In Portugal, the Convent of Christ at Tomar drew ever more attention, its round church seen as a direct link to the Temple of Jerusalem itself. These places became pilgrimage sites, not for faith, but for imagination. The Romantic mind loved ruins, and Templar ruins were particularly rich with symbolism. Ivy-covered towers were seen not as decay, but as testimony evidence of a lost age when men lived by vows and died for ideals. Travelers whispered of hidden tunnels, buried vaults, and forgotten relics. Folklore fused with romantic literature until every ruin seemed to guard a secret. Even peasants living near old commanderies told stories of spectral knights riding at midnight, mantles glowing pale beneath the moon, keeping eternal watch over lands that had once been theirs. Romantics also embraced the paradox at the heart of the Templars. They were monks and warriors, poor yet wealthy, humble yet powerful. These contradictions made them more than mere historical figures, they made them archetypes of tragedy. The Romantics, fascinated by the conflict between ideals and reality, saw in the Templars the embodiment of the eternal struggle. Purity betrayed by politics, loyalty crushed by greed, faith extinguished by corruption. In them, they saw reflections of their own age's disillusionment, its longing for meaning in a world of revolutions and industrial machine. By the mid-19th century, the Templars had become fixtures of literature, art, and even opera. Their image was no longer one of dusty archives or papal decrees, but of glowing martyrdom and tragic nobility. Painters sold canvases of Jacques de Molay's execution, poets recited stanzas about the fall of Acre, novelists penned conspiracies reaching from the Holy Land to the streets of Paris. Everywhere, the Templars were reinvented as symbols of mystery and loss, a canvas onto which each artist could project their own longings and fears. This romantic revival ensured that the Templars were not only remembered, but transformed. They were no longer just medieval knights. They were symbols of the Middle Ages themselves, noble, enigmatic, doomed, and beautiful in their ruin. The 19th century gave them immortality in culture, ensuring that when the 20th century came with its appetite for pulp fiction, cinema, and conspiracy, the Templars were ready to ride again, this time not with swords, but with myths that would spread further than their armies ever had. Popular culture and conspiracy. If the Romantic movement clothed the Templars in tragedy and grandeur, the modern age clothed them in mystery and intrigue. The 20th and 21st centuries transformed the Knights of the Temple into ubiquitous figures of popular culture, their white mantles and red crosses appearing not only in scholarly histories and romantic novels, but in pulp magazines, films, comics, and video games. What had once been the legacy of archives and ruins became a living current in entertainment and conspiracy alike, ensuring that the Templars were as familiar to audiences of the modern world as they had been to medieval pilgrims. The ground for this transformation had been prepared long before Hollywood. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writers of adventure fiction began weaving the Templars into tales of lost relics and secret societies. The Victorian fascination with the occult, combined with the romantic love of ruins, provided fertile soil. Popular magazines carried stories of buried Templar treasure, whispered to lie beneath ruined chapels in France, beneath the hills of Portugal, or on faraway islands. Local legends, once confined to villages, were reprinted in cheap print runs and spread to wide audiences hungry for hidden truths. By the interwar years, the Templars had become stock characters in pulp fiction. In adventure tales, they were guardians of holy relics. In detective stories, the custodians of riddles left behind in cryptic manuscripts. In some, They were villains, secret cabals pulling strings behind the scenes. In others, they were noble survivors, keepers of the Grail or defenders of sacred wisdom against modern corruption. The flexibility of their legend made them endlessly adaptable. Cinema magnified this fascination. The silver screen, hungry for heroes and mysteries, quickly recognized the dramatic appeal of the Templars. Films of the early and mid-20th century depicted them in sweeping battle scenes, charging across deserts or holding crumbling castles against impossible odds. Later, as conspiracy thrillers rose in popularity, the Templars appeared not only in armor, but in modern suits, reimagined as shadowy descendants manipulating politics and finance from the shadows. One of the most enduring myths, the Templars as guardians of the Holy Grail, entered mainstream consciousness through literature and film. Though no medieval record tied the order to the Grail, the legend proved irresistible to modern storytellers. By the time of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989, it was almost taken for granted that the last guardians of the Grail would be Templars, hidden away in a secret desert temple, waiting for the worthy. This cinematic image, thrilling to audiences, cemented their role in global popular imagination as keepers of eternal secrets. The rise of video games carried their legend into an entirely new medium. The Assassin's Creed series, beginning in 2007, placed the Templars at the center of a sprawling alternate history, portraying them as a shadow empire stretching across centuries, seeking to dominate humanity through control of relics and knowledge. Here, they were not martyrs but masterminds, rivals to the fictional assassin brotherhood, eternal adversaries in a war spanning from the Crusades to the modern day. Millions of players encountered the Templars not in dusty textbooks, but in interactive quests, battles, and conspiracies. The games made the Order's name and imagery instantly recognizable even to those who had never opened a history book. Parallel to popular entertainment, conspiracy theories also gave the Templars new life. Writers in the 20th century increasingly claimed that the Order had never truly been destroyed. Some said their survivors fled to Scotland, fighting alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn. Others linked them to the founding of Switzerland, their discipline reborn in secret cantonal councils. Still, others wove them into grand conspiracies of finance and politics, imagining that their banking practices evolved into hidden control of world economies. The most extravagant theories tied them to hidden knowledge. Authors speculated that the Templars had uncovered the Ark of the Covenant beneath Solomon's temple, or the bloodline of Christ, or secret teachings suppressed by the Church. These ideas flourished in popular alternative history books of the late 20th century, particularly in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. By the time Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code in 2003, millions were primed to accept that the Templars might indeed have been custodians of earth-shattering secrets. Brown's novel, though fictional, sold tens of millions of copies and ensured that the Templars became synonymous worldwide with hidden truths, conspiracies, and forbidden history. The cultural reach of these portrayals cannot be overstated. For many, the Templars are known less through medieval chronicles than through movies, novels, and games. Their story has been reshaped into a kind of cultural shorthand. When one speaks of the Templars today, one may mean Crusader knights of the 12th century, but just as often one means the keepers of the Grail, the puppet masters of history, or the enemies in a video game. They have become archetypes, standing alongside vampires, pirates, and samurai as instantly recognizable figures that transcend their historical origins. And yet, beneath all the modern embellishments, the Templars retain the essence that first drew fascination. They were men of paradox. Even in video games, even in conspiracy theories, the allure rests on the same contradictions that defined their real lives: poverty and wealth, humility and power, piety and violence. Popular culture did not invent their mystique, it only magnified it, adapting the ancient paradox to new mediums. Thus, in the modern age, the Templars achieved what perhaps even Jacques de Molay could not have imagined as he spoke from the flames: immortality not only in chronicles and curses, but in the dreams and entertainments of billions. They ceased to belong solely to history and became citizens of imagination, living forever in the realms of art, story, and speculation. The enduring paradox. The Templars endure not merely because of their deeds or their downfall, but because they embodied a contradiction that human beings find impossible to resist. They were monks, yet they fought wars. They took vows of poverty, yet commanded riches greater than kings. They obeyed without question, yet wielded influence that unsettled both popes and monarchs. They were the humblest of servants and the mightiest of lords, the most disciplined of warriors and the most persecuted of heretics. In their very existence, they stitched together opposites that should not have coexisted, and it is in this paradox that their immortality lies. For medieval contemporaries, this paradox was already evident. Pilgrims to Jerusalem saw men in plain white mantles rising before dawn to chant prayers like monks, then later that same day galloping into battle with lowered lances. Local villagers who supplied their estates saw brothers dressed simply in wool and linen, eating modest rations, yet overseeing estates so vast that their wealth rivaled noble households. Kings who borrowed from them saw administrators of extraordinary competence and humility in manner, yet also bankers who could dictate terms even to royalty. The Templars were never one thing, they were always two, always both, always suspended between extremes. It was this duality that made them admired and feared. To allies, they were the purest knights, untouched by greed or vanity, defenders of the weak and protectors of pilgrims. To enemies, they were hypocrites, hiding ambition behind vows, cloaking greed in piety, wielding power while claiming humility. The same contradictions that earned them reverence also bred suspicion. In an age that craved clear categories, monk or knight, poor or rich, humble or powerful, the Templars confounded definition. That very inability to be pinned down made them vulnerable to charges of corruption. It also made them unforgettable. The paradox extended to their very end. They fell not in battle but in fire, not defeated by armies but undone by politics. Yet even as they were destroyed, their destruction made them larger than life. A king and a pope could suppress an order, confiscate its lands and scatter its men, but how could they suppress an idea? A paradox that continued to trouble the mind. Jacques de Molay's last words became a curse precisely because they crystallized the contradictions. A humble monk, knight calling kings and popes to God's tribunal, a powerless prisoner summoning the mighty to judgment. Later centuries seized on this paradox and expanded it. The Romantics saw them as noble martyrs betrayed by greed. Conspiracists saw them as secret masters hiding in the shadows. Novelists and filmmakers turned them into guardians of wisdom and villains of ambition, sometimes within the same story. The Templars' appeal lay in the fact that they could be both at once, villains and martyrs, guardians and betrayers, monks and warriors. Every age could bend their paradox to its own needs. And this, perhaps, is why the Templars still matter. For they are not only a story about the Middle Ages, they are a mirror. When we look at them, we see our own unresolved tensions. We too live with contradictions, the longing for purity and the thirst for power, the desire for peace and the fascination with war, the pursuit of wealth and the claim to humility. The Templars did not resolve these contradictions, they lived them, embodied them, and were ultimately consumed by them. But in their embodiment lies their lasting relevance. Every ruined chapel, every carved effigy of a knight with a sword, every story of buried treasure whispers of the paradox. They were neither flawless saints nor simple villains. They were men caught between ideals and reality, struggling to serve God while navigating the ambitions of kings. building an institution of discipline and prayer that became entangled in money, politics, and power. They remind us that even the noblest experiments are fragile when they rest on human shoulders. To say the Templars endure because of their paradox is to admit something deeper, that we endure with them. We continue to wrestle with the same questions: can wealth and purity coexist? Can violence ever serve holiness? Can loyalty to higher ideals survive the corruption of politics? The Templars did not answer these questions. They simply lived them, and in doing so, left a story that forces us to ask them still. Thus, their immortality lies not in the castles that crumble or the relics that may or may not exist, but in the way they unsettle the human imagination. They are reminders that contradictions do not vanish with time, they persist, shaping our lives as much as theirs. The Templars, long gone in body, live on because they represent the very tensions of being human. They are at once history and symbol, fact and fable, martyr and monster. They are the enduring paradox, legacy in history and memory. 7 centuries have passed since Jacques de Molay's cry faded into the smoke of the Seine, but the Templars endure. Not as a living order of knights, they were extinguished by decree and flame, but as a presence woven into stone, memory, and imagination. Their legacy is not a single thread, but a tapestry, architectural, economic, military, cultural, and spiritual. To speak of the Templars today is to speak of both history and legend, of what they built in their time and what later centuries built around their memory. Their architectural legacy still rises from hilltops and river valleys. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, the round churches of the order stand as echoes of Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, designed to bring the Holy City into distant lands. The Temple Church in London, with its solemn nave and effigies of recumbent knights, remains a place of worship and wonder. In Portugal, the Convent of Christ at Tomar, with its extraordinary charola, reminds visitors of the Templars' reach and of the survival of their spirit through successor orders. In Syria, ruined castles such as Safed or Tortosa still cling to crags, testifying to the order's military genius and stubborn defense against overwhelming foes. These stones, though weathered, remain eloquent. They tell of men who dreamed not only of prayer and battle but of permanence, of structures that would outlast them, and in this, at least, they succeeded. Their economic innovations ripple silently through the centuries. In their counting houses and commanderies, they pioneered systems of credit, deposit, and transfer that prefigured modern banking. A merchant in Paris could place funds with the Templars and receive a letter redeemable in Acre. A king could entrust his treasury to their vaults and know it would be guarded as securely as his own crown. Their concern was always practical, not theory, but function. Yet the practices they developed, letters of credit, standardized accounting, estate management, became models for later institutions. Every modern bank ledger, every transfer of funds across borders, carries in its DNA the imprint of the Templars. Their military discipline set standards that outlived their fall. Though crushed at Hattin and Acre, they showed what an organized, permanently trained force could achieve in an age when most armies were feudal levies, raised seasonally and dispersed after campaigns. The Templars lived under rule, trained daily, drilled in formation, and maintained their equipment with monastic precision. Their castles were not only fortresses but logistical hubs, nodes in a chain of defense and supply that stretched across continents. The modern professional army finds one of its medieval ancestors in the Knights of the Temple. Their cultural and symbolic legacy may be the most pervasive of all. After their suppression, they became martyrs in the eyes of many, vindicated by the deaths of Philip and Clement. Later, through the Freemasons, they became symbols of resistance to tyranny and keepers of hidden wisdom. In the Romantic era, they were painted as tragic heroes. In the modern age, they became figures of conspiracy and guardians of the Grail. No other medieval order has been so deeply absorbed into the bloodstream of culture. They are at once saints and villains, martyrs and conspirators, historical actors and fictional archetypes. The white mantle and red cross have become universal symbols, instantly recognizable even to those who know nothing of the Crusades. Their spiritual paradox: monks who fought, men of poverty who commanded wealth, servants of Christ who wielded swords, remains their most haunting legacy. They remind us that ideals and reality are always entangled, that purity pursued in the world is always tested by compromise. Their fall warns of the dangers of power without allies, of institutions too independent for kings to tolerate, of wealth that draws envy and suspicion, yet their endurance in memory shows how even destroyed institutions can outlive their enemies through the force of their example. Perhaps their greatest legacy lies not in what they accomplished, but in what they became after death. A story of courage and betrayal, of innovation and corruption, of martyrdom and myth. From pilgrims' roads to Masonic lodges, from romantic novels to video games, the Templars live on as a mirror for each age's desires and fears. To the medieval world, they were warriors of Christ. To the Enlightenment, they were martyrs of tyranny. To the Romantics, they were tragic heroes. To the modern imagination, they are guardians of secrets and conspirators in shadows. Few institutions have been so completely refashioned by memory, yet remained so instantly recognizable. And so the legacy of the Knights Templar stretches far beyond the centuries in which they lived. They remind us that history is not only about what happened, but about what we remember, what we imagine, and what we make of the past. The Templars began with 9 men and a vow to guard pilgrims on dangerous roads. They ended with a pyre by the Seine. But between those 2 points, they built castles, pioneered banking, fought battles, and shaped institutions. And after their fall, they entered legend, ensuring that their memory would outlast kingdoms and dynasties alike. 700 years on, their mantles no longer gleam in sunlight, their lances no longer lower in charge. Yet in stone, in law, in culture, in myth, they remain. The Knights Templar, poor soldiers of Christ, guardians of pilgrims, bankers of kings, martyrs of fire, have become one of the most enduring symbols of the human imagination. Their true fortress is no longer Jerusalem, Acre, or Paris. It is memory itself, where the red cross still burns, bright against the long shadows of history. The eternal cross. History closes its chapters with dates and decrees. Kings die, papal bulls are issued, orders are dissolved, and the chroniclers move on to the next reign, the next war. But memory does not obey history's limits. Memory carries forward what is too powerful to vanish. So it is with the Knights Templar. Their fortress walls have crumbled into ruin, their treasure vaults stand empty, their banners lie faded in museum cases, but the red cross they bore has not disappeared. It lingers, not on the battlefield, but in the imagination. The Templar story has always been one of paradox. Monks who fought, poor men who grew rich, servants of God who clashed with kings. That paradox was never resolved, it was only consumed by fire. Yet in being consumed, it was released into legend, where paradox thrives and endures. Jacques de Molay's cry from the stake still echoes across 7 centuries, not because of the words themselves, but because every age has found in them what it wished to hear: vengeance, justice, prophecy, defiance. The eternal cross of the Templars is not carved in stone or stitched into cloth. It is the symbol that has passed through time, changing shape but never fading. It gleams in the round churches they built, circles back in the rituals of Freemasonry, glows in the oils of romantic painters, flashes in the reels of modern cinema, and flickers on the screens of video games. From Gothic cathedrals to paperback thrillers, from solemn effigies to pulp conspiracies, the white mantle and red cross still march on. And beneath the myths, treasures buried, grails guarded, secrets whispered, lies, something simpler and more human. The Templars endure because they embodied the eternal tension between ideal and reality. They remind us that even those who vow poverty may wield power, that even those who preach peace may take up arms, that even those who swear loyalty may be betrayed. They are not saints, nor demons, nor masterminds in shadow. They are us magnified by circumstance, tested by power, undone by envy, remembered by story. When night falls over ruined castles and the wind stirs through broken cloisters, it is easy to imagine the sound of hoofbeats, the faint shimmer of white mantles beneath the moon. The knights are gone, but their presence lingers half in history, half in myth, wholly alive in memory. The eternal cross they bore has become not just a mark of their order, but a symbol of the human condition, noble and flawed, disciplined and vulnerable, forever striving, forever undone, forever remembered. And so the tale ends where it began, with a vow. 9 men once promised to defend pilgrims on dangerous roads. That vow grew into an institution, was broken on the wheel of politics, yet outlived kings and popes in memory. Their castles have fallen, their coffers have emptied, their order has vanished, but the vow remains etched in stone, in legend, in imagination. The Templars live still, not as soldiers on earth, but as watchmen in the towers of history, their red cross shining against the shadows of time.